Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. Dedrick D. Gobert, best remembered for his brief but memorable role in John Singleton's 1990s crime drama film Boys and the Hood. Dedrick D. Gobert played the character Dookie, the wisecracking friend to Trey Styles and member of Doughboy's Crip gang. Although his role was small, his portrayal is notable for his sucking on an ever-present pacifier, something he is often cited as the originator of the pacifier trend that would become popular among teenagers and young adults during the early 1990s. Gobert began his brief acting career, which spanned over 4 years, by starring in several commercials but would later appear in 3 films, all of which were written and directed by John Singleton. Much like his on-screen co-star Lloyd Avery too, his life was senselessly cut short, and he died just days before turning 23. Gobert was killed in a fight over a weekend drag race, gunned down along with a friend during an argument with several Blood gang members in Mira Loma, California. On the day of his death, Gobert, or V-Dub, as he was known to friends and acquaintances, had been attending an illegal drag race with several others, including his girlfriend. Newspaper articles at the time record that he died from a gang-related shooting. However, it is unknown if Gobert, an up-and-coming actor, had ever affiliated with gang members in the past. According to police sources, the perpetrators fled the scene of the crime in a 1993 or 1994 Honda Prelude. Gobert grew up under his mother's care, and Carolyn Gobert described her son as a friendly person who liked to joke with people and make them laugh. One incident from his past would seem to indicate that despite his comical nature, he was capable of violence. On August 6, 1989, Craig Netherly went to Gobert's house to resolve a dispute. Netherly and Gobert had grown up in the same neighborhood, and when he exited the residence as Netherly arrived, the teenaged Gobert was holding a handgun. On the day of his death, Gobert, or V-Dub, as he was known to friends and acquaintances, had been attending an illegal drag race with several others, including his girlfriend. Newspaper articles at the time record that he died from a gang-related shooting. However, it is unknown if Gobert, an up-and-coming actor, had ever affiliated with gang members in the past. According to police sources, the perpetrators fled the scene of the crime in a 1993 or 1994 Honda Prelude. Gobert grew up under his mother's care, and Carolyn Gobert described her son as a friendly person who liked to joke with people and make them laugh. One incident from his past would seem to indicate that despite his comical nature, he was capable of violence. On August 6, 1989, Craig Netherly went to Gobert's house to resolve a dispute. Netherly and Gobert had grown up in the same neighborhood, and when he exited the residence as Netherly arrived, the teenaged Gobert was holding a handgun. When John Singleton started the casting process for his featured directorial debut crime drama entitled Boys and the Hood, a coming-of-age story that was based on his own life and the people he knew growing up, he intended to star mostly locals, in order to keep a sense of realism. His project depicted gang culture and the lives of 3 young African Americans growing up in South Central Los Angeles. Filmed on location between October to November 1990, the cast starred Cuba Gooding Jr. and Ice Cube as the lead roles of Trey Styles and Darren Doughboy Baker, 2 school friends who would both take different paths in life. Styles would grow up under the influence of his father Furious, who wanted to instill in him some valuable life lessons, while Darren becomes a Crips gang member, serving time in jail for petty gang and drug-related crimes. In one of the most poignant scenes in the film, Doughboy's brother Ricky, played Morris Chestnut, is running away with Gooding's Trey Styles when he gunned down by a gang member. This iconic scene, where Lloyd Avery Toos gun-toting knuckhead number 2 leans out of the window of a red 1988 Hyundai Excel and blasts Ricky. This scene would be a turning point for Avery, who would go on to become a real-life blood gangster, which ultimately led to his own death. Born as Dedrick Dwayne Fontenot on November 25, 1971, in Shreveport, Louisiana, Gobert met Singleton, an Inglewood native, when he worked at the post office and had to drive mail from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, during which he would sometimes bring girls along with him. The two struck up a friendship, and when Singleton had written the script for Boys and the Hood, he offered Gobert the supporting part of Dookie, a childhood friend and member of Doughboy's Crips gang. Gobert's portrayal of Dookie is best remembered for his iconic pacifier, which his character used throughout the whole movie. Dookie's use of a pacifier has been cited as igniting the trend that would become popular with teenagers and young adults during that time, while others believe Flavor Flav, who wore one around his neck in a Public Enemy video, was the true originator. Gobert had actually sucked on pacifiers in real life in an effort to quit smoking. Writer-director John Singleton thought it was so cool that he decided to use it in the film. His supporting role in Boys was the start of his theatrical acting career. The film would prove to be both a financial and critical success, and was praised for its emotional acting and powerful writing. At the 64th Academy Awards, it was nominated for Best Director and Best Original Screenplay, making Singleton the youngest person and the first African American to be nominated for Best Director. During the editing process for Boys, Singleton started writing the draft script for a movie he called Poetic Justice. This movie, starring Janet Jackson as Justice, is about a young woman who decides to become a hairdresser after witnessing the murder of her first and only boyfriend. She copes with her depression by writing poetry and strikes up a friendship with Lucky, played by Tupac Shakur. The plot of the 1993 movie was based on Tupac's brief romance with Marie Rose, with whom he had struck up a relationship in between takes on the set of the film Juice, in which he starred. Rose was an aspiring poet who frequented the Brooklyn Moon Cafe in Green, Brooklyn, while studying at Brooklyn College, and was known for her trademark braids. Once again, Singleton used some of the same actors he had cast in Boys, including his friend Gobert. Starring alongside Regina King, Lloyd Avery II, Tyra Farrell and John Cothran, all of whom had appeared with him in Singleton's Boys, Gobert was cast in the small role of Lloyd. The film would go on to reach #1 in the U.S. box office on its opening weekend, and for her role, Jackson received an Academy Award and Golden Globe nominations for her song Again, which also reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Despite its mixed reviews from critics, it would go on to gain a cult following. With 2 acting credits under his belt, Gobert would star in what would be his last role in Singleton's 1995 crime drama Higher Learning, that follows the changing lives of 3 incoming freshmen at the fictional Columbus University. Starring alongside his Boys co-stars Regina King, Ice Cube and Lawrence Fishburne, the latter 2 would both be nominated for Outstanding Actor in a Motion Picture, for which Fishburne would win. Gobert played the role of Fudge's homie, one of Ice Cube's friends, but he would never see the finished film, which was released in September 1995, almost a year after his tragic death. Around this time, the 22-year-old Gobert began dating 16-year-old Jenny Hyen, who was with him on the night of his murder. Just 6 days before his 23rd birthday, Gobert would become involved in an argument that would cost him his life. During the early morning hours of November 19, 1994, Gobert, along with Hyen and his friend, 19-year-old Ignacio Hernandez of Rosemead, along with their friends Christine Mail Gillers and Herman Flores and a group of others, attended an illegal street race in the area of Etiwanda Avenue in Mira Loma, California. Both Gobert and Hernandez participated in the races, with Gobert driving his Volkswagen Rabbit and Hernandez in a Honda Del Sol. During a race that Hernandez participated in, another vehicle pulled in front of him, which caused him to brake to avoid a collision. He then got out of his car and began arguing with the driver of the car that had cut him off. The 2 men started a physical fight, but then the other driver ran to a nearby group of about 10 people, who were also described as Latino, and they proceeded to surround Hernandez and started fighting him. When sirens started sounding, Hernandez and his friends, including Gobert, ran to their cars, drove to Etiwanda Avenue, and parked on the street in front of a pizza parlor. Hernandez drove with Hyen in his black Honda, while Gillers and Flores rode with Gobert. They became separated from their other friends and got out to see if they could see them. At this point, they saw the other Latino group, which had been fighting with Hernandez. This group approached and began yelling at Hernandez, and his group responded in kind. During this verbal argument, one member of the Latino gang pulled what was described as a silver chrome handgun and pointed it at Hyen. Gillers later testified it was pointed directly at her forehead, while Hyen herself said it was pointed at the group as a whole. When she yelled at the gunman, an older member of the Latino group said something to the gunman, who placed the gun back inside his pocket. The hostile group then walked away. That same night, several members and associates of this criminal street gang, known as the Acro Boys Krasy or ABC, including Eric Garcia, Roger Boring, Lester Maliwat, and Sonny Inraka, had also attended the races. This gang was affiliated with the Bloods, who used hand signs to both identify themselves and warn off rivals, and was violently territorial. Earlier that evening, the gang members had met at Boring's house, and they drove several cars in the races. Raka, carrying a snub-nosed revolver, rode with Mollywood. When the siren sounded, the ABC gang members parked in and around the pizza parlor on Etiwanda, and several of the gang members gathered in the pizza parlor parking lots and against the wall facing Etiwanda Avenue. At some point, Roger Boring noticed Dedrick Gobert and Judy Hyen walking back and forth, and as they did, they were talking about the earlier gang they encountered. Gobert, Hyen, Gillers, Hernandez, and Flores then decided that their other friends must have left, and they decided to leave too. Before they did, Gobert got into his Volkswagen and drove up and down Etiwanda, before pulling back in behind Hernandez's car. Gillers later said that she believed Gobert was taking one last look around for their other friends before leaving. Boring also saw Gobert drive off in his car and return. He later described how Gobert slammed on his brakes when stopping in front of the ABC group. Mollywood testified that he saw Gobert circle the block in his car, and said he looked at the ABC group in what he believed was the wrong way. Gillers said she noticed the ABC gang members, that they were dressed in red, a blood gang color, and heard some of them say, "Blood, blood, blood," in their conversations while looking over at her group. She said she warned Gobert about this, but he approached the ABC gang members anyway. Gobert said to them, "What's up, cuz?" and "Fuck bloods, fuck slobs," and claimed to be a Mafia Crips member. He also raised his arms and made a Crip gang hand sign. The things Gobert said were an insult to a blood gang like ABC, and some of the gang members responded by saying, "What's up, blood?" an insult to a Crip gang member. Garden Grove Police Officer Michael Martin, a former gang officer with expertise in gangs and gang culture, was familiar with the ABC gang, which had originated in Orange County in 1988 to 1989. According to Martin, the insults from Gobert required the ABC Blood Gang to beat him down in order to maintain respect. Martin explains that such a beatdown would be for the benefit of, in association with, and at the behest of the gang. Gillers testified that the ABC gang members rushed Gobert before he was able to put his hands down and began beating him. Both Mollywood and Boring testified that their fellow ABC gang members thought it was humorous that Gobert would insult such a large group of bloods and laughed at him. Boring added that Gobert appeared intoxicated because he zigzagged on his feet. Hyen and Gillers believed that Gobert had drank most of a 40-ounce bottle of malt liquor while at the races, but said he drank nothing before that. A 40-ounce bottle of malt liquor was later found near the pizza parlor by Riverside County Sheriff's Detective Eric Speidel. It contained 2 ounces of liquid. Both Boring and Mollywood would claim that Gobert was rushed by the gang members when he responded to the gang's insults by reaching under his shirt, as though he was packing a gun. The gang, around 15 to 20 strong, began hitting and kicking Gobert. Gillers, Hernandez, and Hyen rushed in, shouting, "Stop it. That's enough," and tried to help Gobert. As the fighting carried on, the warring groups of people backed across the northbound lanes, over the center median, and into the southbound lanes of Etiwanda. It was here where Gobert ended up on the ground, being kicked, hit, and stomped. Hernandez attempted to free Gobert by pulling people away, and had gotten on top of Gobert to protect him. At that moment, Claudio Hortia, one of ABC gang members, kicked Hernandez in the head. Gillers forced her way into the crowd, and saw Gobert and Hernandez being attacked. She got on top of Hernandez, trying to protect him, and was kicked in the face, ending up stunned on the ground. Thinking that the fight was over, Boring began walking back to the cars, while Mollywood, having been knocked down by Hernandez, and also thinking the fight had finished, heard someone say something about a gun, and he ran. As Gillers staggered to her feet, she heard 2 to 3 gunshots, and then everyone began running. Hyen was outside the circle of people fighting when she heard the shots. Boring testified that he looked back before any shots were fired, and he saw Sonny and Raka grab Hernandez by the head or shoulder, raise his upper body, and shoot Hernandez. Raka then stood over Gobert, pointed the gun, and shot him. After shooting Gobert and Hernandez, Boring saw a woman approach Raka and push or kick him from behind. Raka then turned and fired a shot at her. This woman was Jenny Hyen. Mollywood said when he got to his car he turned back and saw Raka fire at Gobert and Hernandez. Mollywood then quickly got in his car, and as he pulled out of the parking lot and onto Etiwanda, Raka got in. Mollywood could see a woman lying on the ground in an awkward position and asked Raka why he shot the girl. Raka replied, "Fuck them. They deserved it." As Mollywood drove away from the area, Raka took the expended shells from the revolver and threw them out of the car window. Eric Garcia, another of the ABC gang members, had stayed in the car he rode in and was listening to the radio, but got out when he was told about the fight. As he walked through the parking lot toward the street, he said he saw the fight in which the ABC gang heavily outnumbered their opponents. Before reaching the street, he heard 2 or 3 gunshots and saw everyone had started running away. Garcia then ran back to the car and drove away. Garcia stopped at a nearby Denny's restaurant, where he learned from Claudio that Enraca had been the one doing the shooting. After leaving the restaurant, Garcia went to Boring's house where he confronted Enraca, who at first refused to answer Garcia's knock on Enraca's bedroom door. When he asked Sonny what happened and why he shot the girl, Enraca became angry, and the 2 men got into a pushing match. Finally, Enraca told him maybe they deserved it. Garcia said he asked Enraca to hand over the gun. Enraca refused, and Garcia went outside. As he came outside, Enraca asked Garcia to take the gun, which he did, and kept it in his closet for a few days until Enraca came by asking for it and took it back. Back at the pizza parlor parking lot, sheriff's deputies began arriving at the scene of the shooting at around 2:20 a.m. and found Gobert and Hernandez dead in the roadway on Etiwanda Avenue. Jenny Hyen was still alive, but was lying on the roadway and was falling in and out of consciousness. She had a bullet wound to the right side of her neck and was immediately transported to hospital. During surgery, a bullet was removed. However, she remained paralyzed from the neck down, with some movement in her left arm, but only a little bit of movement in her right. From the wound, doctors removed a damaged .38 bullet. This bullet had marks consistent with slippage, distortion in the rifling impressions, which indicated it could have been fired from a revolver, but it is possible to get slippage from a semi-automatic. However, forensic officers could find no .38 shell casings at the Etiwanda crime scene or around the deceased victims' bodies. The forensic pathologist conducting the autopsies of Gobert and Hernandez, Dr. Daryl Garber, recorded that he observed external trauma on both victims, which was consistent with having been caused during a fight. Hernandez had suffered 2 gunshot wounds which caused his death. The entrance wound of the first gunshot was located to the left rear of his head, above and behind the left ear. The bullet fragmented, and a portion was lodged under the skin at the entrance wound. The other part of the bullet had traveled through Hernandez's brain and lodged under the skin on the forehead. The failure of the bullet to exit through the skin, as well as an abrasion on the skin overlaying the lodged bullet, indicated that Hernandez's head was resting against a very hard surface, such as the ground, at the moment the bullet was fired. The second bullet had entered Hernandez's left back, traveled through the lower and upper left lung, perforated the heart and right lung, then stopped in the muscles of the right front chest. Dedrick D. Gobert had suffered a single gunshot wound located on the right rear of his head, above and behind his right ear, which was the cause of his death. The bullet had become fragmented and lodged in his brain. These wounds were not contact wounds, but had been fired from a minimum distance of 1.5 to 2 feet away. The day after the shootings, Enraca reportedly told Boring that he was going to turn himself in, saying that he would be found sooner or later. Acting on information provided by witness Claudio Hortia, police arrested 22-year-old Sonny Enraca on December 12, 1994. Enraca was interviewed by Riverside Sheriff's Detective John Schultz, which was tape-recorded and later played to the jury. Enraca denied any involvement in the shootings, claiming he had spent the evening watching movies with his girlfriend, and reiterated that he had not left the house all night. Schultz told Enraca that several of his friends had disputed his alibi, and that there were witnesses who identified him as the shooter. The interview ended when Enraca asked for a lawyer. As Detective Schultz prepared paperwork, he turned Enraca over to Detective Eric Spindle for the pre-booking process, during which he was fingerprinted and photographed, then allowed to call his girlfriend. While Spindle filled out the booking form, Enraca asked when he would get a lawyer, and Spindle explained the charging and arraignment process to him, including appointment of counsel. While he continued to fill out forms, Enraca asked Spindle if a reward had been offered for the perpetrator of the shooting, to which Spindle told him he wasn't aware of any reward. Enraca then said he understood that one had been offered. Spindle told him that people will come forward with information with or without a reward. At that point Enraca said, "It's not how it went down." Detective Spindle tried to put Enraca off by saying that different people see things differently, and went back to the booking form. Enraca then said that no one has honor or respect anymore, to which Spindle agreed. He put his head down and said, "That's the way it is nowadays." At this point, Spindle reminded Inraka that he had asked for a lawyer, so the detective could not ask him questions, and Inraka replied, "Well, what if I say what happened?" In response, Spindle told Inraka that he would get a tape recorder and let him talk, but that he couldn't ask questions unless Inraka wanted him to. When asked if he wanted to make a statement on tape, Inraka said he did not want to implicate anyone but himself. When reminded again that Spindle could not ask questions unless he Inraka wanted him to, Inraka said he did. With that, Spindle obtained a tape recorder and recorded Inraka. He began by saying, "I did this," and went to say he did not want to involve anyone else. He said he had been carrying a gun after a friend had previously been shot in a gang-related incident, and said he advised his friend to report it to the police. Inraka said after the ABC gang meeting, he went with his fellow gang members to the races and rode along with Lester Mollywet. For protection, he brought his gun along. Inraka said he had drunk alcohol before leaving, and he was coming down from using speed. He described the night of the shooting, explaining that they parked on the opposite side of the street from the gas station, and he walked across the street to talk to a friend. At that moment, he saw Dedrich D. Gobert drive up fast, like he was angry, take something out of his car, and then walk towards Roger Boring while doing something with his belt. It appeared to the ABC gang that he had a gun, and then Gobert claimed he belonged to a Crip gang, and when Inraka's group started laughing at him, Gobert began insulting them. He said Roger responded with an insult, and Inraka told him to kick back. Inraka said he thought Gobert had mistaken them for another Asian group, and said Hernandez, Gillers and Hyen were by the car, and that Hyen said, "That's not them." Inraka said he saw Gobert reaching, then someone shouted, "He's reaching," and one of the ABC gang punched Gobert. When Gobert grabbed the person who punched him, Inraka said everyone in his group rushed in, along with Hernandez, Gillers, and Hyen. As the fight moved across the street, Inraka said he tried to break it up. At one point Gobert was knocked to the ground, and Hernandez was covering him. Intending to break up the fight, Inraka pulled his gun to shoot in the air, but said he thought he recognized Hernandez, so grabbed him by the hair and lifted his face, asking him where he was from. He said Hernandez, then hit his hand. At the trial, it was revealed that a fist-sized clump of what was described as black, kinky hair was located on the street at the scene of the shooting, a few feet away from the bodies. The clump was matted and all but 4 of the hairs were torn or broken and without roots, which had not been shed. In the opinion of Marianne Stamm, a criminalist with the California Department of Justice, the hair had been forcibly removed and were consistent with hair samples collected during the autopsy of Dedrich D. Gobert. Inraka said he believed that Hernandez was going to grab Gobert's gun, so he shot Hernandez in the shoulder. Then Hernandez leaned over and, thinking he was going to shoot him, Inraka shot Hernandez again. He said Gobert looked at him, said "Fuck you asshole," and began pushing Hernandez off of him. Inraka said he thought Gobert was going for his own gun, and so shot him. As he turned, Jenny Hyen pushed him and came at him. He said he raised his gun, hoping to scare her, waved his other hand at her, and backed up. When Hyen charged him again, he said he pulled the trigger, thinking he was firing over her head. Altogether, Inraka said he fired 4 shots from his 5-shot revolver, a snub-nosed .38 special. He then got into Lester's car and threw the gun out onto the freeway during the ride home. He reiterated that he had been drinking that evening, but was not drunk. He again said he was coming down from speed and had consumed 2 lines, one at about 5 p.m. and the second sometime between 8 o'clock and 9 p.m. After giving his statement, Inraka agreed to accompany Detective Spindle in an attempt to locate the gun. During the drive, Inraka said he removed the expended shells and threw them out of the car window, and then threw the gun out onto the freeway. The gun was never located. The next day Inraka accompanied Detective Spindle to the scene of the crime, and there reenacted his version of the shootings, which was videotaped. On several occasions after his arrest, Inraka spoke with Garcia and told him he had confessed. On March 13, 1998, the District Attorney of Riverside County filed an amended information charging appellant, Sonny Inraka, with the murder of Ignacio Hernandez, the murder of Dedrich D. Gobert, and the attempted murder of Jenny Hyen. As to all 3 charges, it was alleged that the crimes were committed for the benefit of, at the direction of, and in association with a criminal gang. Inraka pleaded not guilty and denied the allegations. Inraka's jury trial commenced on March 10, 1999, at Riverside County Superior Court before Judge W. Charles Morgan. Several members of the ABC gang testified at the trial. Derek Taguchi said that he was at Roger Boring's house the night of November 18, 1994, and used methamphetamine within Raqqa. He said they used it a couple of hours before everyone left for the races, but he couldn't remember how much they had used. Dr. James Rosenberg, a forensic psychiatrist specializing in psychopharmacology, with experience in treating methamphetamine-induced disorders, described methamphetamine as a strong stimulant with an 11-hour half-life that affects thinking, judgment, and impulse control. As well as the physical symptoms, he also described the mental symptoms as something akin to paranoid schizophrenia or the manic phase of manic depressive illness. He testified that in Raqqa's described actions were consistent with methamphetamine intoxication. The blood alcohol testing of autopsy blood samples from Dedrick D. Gobert and Ignacio Hernandez revealed blood alcohol levels of 0.16 and 0.14 respectively. Blood drawn from Jenny Hyen at 3:13 a.m. was tested and revealed a blood alcohol level of 0.11. Toxicologist Maureen Black described expected symptoms of those levels to include slurred speech, balance, mental impairment, and an exaggerated emotional state. Several of the ABC gang members or associates described Gobert as appearing to be intoxicated and aggressive when he confronted the ABC gang members in front of the pizza parlor. Gobert also drove recklessly before stopping in front of the group, yelling insults, claimed to be a Crip gang member, made Crip hand signs, and put his hand either under his shirt or behind his back as though he had a gun. Eyewitness Daryl Arquero testified that he saw a shiny object in Gobert's pants when he lifted his shirt, and said he had a gun. However, under cross-examination, Arquero acknowledged that when interviewed by law enforcement, he said nothing about seeing a shiny object and said he did not see a gun when Gobert lifted his shirt. Similarly, John Frick, another eyewitness, testified that Gobert had simply grabbed his crotch, and when he lifted his shirt, Frick could see that Gobert did not have a gun. Arthur Balamide testified that when Gobert was attacked by the ABC group and he retreated across the street, people were moving away from the area of the fight, and Gobert was on the ground, badly beaten, and wasn't moving when he was shot. Balamide, who said he had previously met in Raqqa, but did not see him in the group that rushed Gobert, claimed that although he could see the shooter, he could not see who the shooter was, saying, "I don't know exactly who it was, but you could see a person." However, Balamide also said he knew and did not remember seeing Molly Watt, Boring or Cedric Lopez, other members of the ABC gang. He added that he did not remember seeing a second person on the ground with Gobert, and did not remember seeing any girls involved in the fight. Alfred Ward claimed that when the group attacked Gobert, they yelled, "This is hyper-tech." Once the fight subsided, Ward claimed to have heard someone say, "Fuck it, John. Just shoot him." He said he saw a person run across the street to a car, obtain something and run back. Then he heard gunfire. He testified he saw the shooter standing over both victims firing at point-blank range, and actually lift each victim's head before shooting them. Ward described the shooter as having a 7 to 8 inch multicolored tail of hair at the back of his head, wearing a hooded sweatshirt, and firing a small semi-automatic handgun. Ward also testified that he was not sure if the shooter was the same person he had seen run to the car, and during cross-examination he testified he did not actually lay his eyes on the exact shooter that night. Ward offered conflicting testimony regarding the person he saw commit the shooting. He claimed this stemmed from his state of being hysterical and not lucid from seeing the shootings. This claim was refuted by the officer who interviewed Ward. Jenny Hyen, the only one to survive the shootings, testified that her spinal cord was severed by the bullet in Raqqa fired, and that she will be in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. The injuries cause her difficulty breathing, and except for the pain in one arm, which makes it difficult to sleep, she cannot feel anything below her chest. In Raqqa, who had been born in the Philippines, had been raised by his extended family from birth to the age of 8. Growing up, he had a happy childhood, was described as a good and loving child who was loved and treated like a son by those who took him in. At the age of 8, his mother collected Sonny, and they moved to the United States. His stepfather was emotionally and physically abusive toward Inraqa's mother and all the children. Inraqa did not initially join the ABC gang, unlike his friend, Famalo Kialda, but he did eventually join. He lived with the families of other gang members and worked at that time. A cultural mental health expert, Dr. Gene Neidorf, believes that Inraqa had been uprooted from his nurtured environment and felt abandoned, alone, weak, and powerless. He developed a need to see himself as important. When Enraka joined the ABC gang, Dr. Nydorf believes that he created a new reality to overcome his vulnerability, in which the gang felt like family, which, in the Filipino culture, is the source of a persona's role and moral and social development. She claimed that her conclusions about his emotional problems were consistent with a videotape of Enraka at the time of and following his statement to Detective Spindle. She said she believed that Enraka expressed remorse on the videotape. But the prosecution presented the image of Enraka as a leading gang member who had killed the victims when his honor and that his gang had been disrespected. Hernandez and Gobert were laying semi-conscious on the ground when Enraka approached and shot Hernandez in the back and in the back of the head, then shot Gobert in the back of the head. The prosecutor aptly characterized these killings as executions, not simply murders. The jury found Enraka guilty of both murder charges on May 5, 1999, setting the degree of the murders at first. He was found guilty of a multiple murder special circumstance finding and assault with a deadly weapon with intent to cause great bodily injury, a lesser included offense of the attempted murder charge. On May 12th, the penalty phase began, and on May 27th, the jury returned a verdict of death. Enraka's lawyers attempted to request a trial, but on July 23rd, the trial court denied the motions. After 20 years on death row, Enraka received a reprieve from then Governor Gavin Newsom, who signed a sweeping order in March 2019, putting an executive moratorium on California's death penalty, which granted the same reprieve to another 736 inmates on death row. The life and death of Dedrick D. Gobert mimicked that of another young actor whose life was taken before his full acting potential had been realized. Lloyd Avery too had appeared in 2 movies alongside Gobert, Boys and the Hood and Poetic Justice, and both would be murdered, their deaths stemming directly and indirectly from their association with criminal gangs. Avery was murdered in prison by his Satan-worshipping cellmate, Kevin Roby, while serving a sentence for the murders of 2 drug dealers in July 1999. Gobert played a Crips gang member in Boys, and claimed to be one prior to his death, while Avery played a Blood in the same film, and eventually joined the Black P-Stones, a subset of the Bloods criminal gang. In a case of art imitating life, these 2 young men embraced the gangster lifestyle, and it led to their deaths. Case 2. Who is Kevin Roby? On September 6, 2005, correctional officers at Pelican Bay State Prison entered one of the shared cells, and there found the body of 36-year-old Lloyd Avery II. The former Hollywood actor had been bludgeoned and strangled to death by the other occupant of the cell, Kevin Roby, who had performed what appeared to be acts of ritualistic worship with the dead body of his fellow cellmate. The murder of Avery occurred 2 days prior to the discovery of his body, and there were many unanswered questions about just how the prison guards had failed to notice or realize that a gruesome murder had been perpetrated by a dangerous criminal with a sickening criminal past. The motive for the crime is equally shocking, as it appeared to be an apparent ceremonial covenant carried out by a Satanist. Since December 1989, when the Pelican Bay State Prison was opened, there had been some 17 murders up to September 2005. In order to understand the 18 murder, which as fate would have it turned out to be the brutal death of actor Lloyd Avery II, it is necessary to look at the life and crimes of Kevin Roby, the man who committed a senseless murder that correctional officers failed to prevent. At the age of 23, Kevin Roby, an Air Force Academy dropout, was sentenced for the murder of a member of his own family. On January 31, 1987, detectives arrived at the home of Roby's mother, who lived at West 37th Street in Los Angeles. They were there to question Roby about his eyewitness testimony concerning the apparent abduction of his older sister, 25-year-old Velma Lynn Hill. According to Roby, Hill had been kidnapped from their mother's home by 3 men dressed as Japanese ninja warriors. He could offer very little information about the men who carried off his sister, but detectives asked him if he would walk them through the kidnapping crime scene. As he did, the detectives found his sister's body covered with dog food in a large trash can. With suspicion cast on his version of events, Roby was arrested. It was found that Velma Lynn Hill had died a particularly violent death. She had been raped twice, sodomized, and strangled. Charged with murder, Roby was convicted in May 1988 at a non-jury trial by Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Robert Altman, of 1 count each of murder, sodomy, and 2 counts of rape. He was also charged with raping another sister and received a sentence of life in prison without parole. When Pelican Bay opened in December 1989, Roby was sent to the Supermax facility, where he joined the other 40% of the inmate population who were serving life sentences for a range of violent crimes. At some point during his incarceration, Kevin Roby began taking an interest in Satanism. This interest eventually encapsulated his beliefs, and he replaced any previous religious ideas he might have had with a firm conviction in Satan. This new religion manifested itself to such an extent that Roby would refer to himself in correspondence as Satanic Christ. His time at Pelican Bay had been without incident. However, Roby was kept in a single cell to himself. In March 2001, a new prisoner arrived at Pelican Bay, one that would have a profound effect, albeit negatively, on the Kevin Roby. 31-year-old Lloyd Avery, too, had been sentenced to life in prison on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The former actor, who had starred in the hugely successful 1991 movie Boys and the Hood, in which he had played the member of a Bloods gang responsible for an on-screen murder. Off-screen, however, Avery had begun to associate with real-life Bloods gangsters, and soon his film career had taken second place to his newfound gang lifestyle that imitated his film roles that earned him some measure of short-lived success. Police suspect he had already committed several drive-by shootings involving rival gang members. On July 1, 1999, Avery committed a double murder. According to police reports, at around 4 p.m., Avery approached Annette Lewis and Percy Branch, both of whom were sitting under a tree near Santa Barbara Plaza. An argument ensued, allegedly over a drug debt, and Avery pulled out a .45 caliber pistol, firing it at Lewis before turning the gun on Branch, shooting him in the stomach. Later that day, Lewis died, but the mortally wounded Branch survived for another 3 weeks before finally succumbing to complications from his wounds. After this, Avery brazenly decided he wouldn't go into hiding. He even filmed 2 movies, Lockdown in 2000 and Shot in 2001, in which he played the gangster G-Ride, as well as serving as a technical advisor for director Roger Roth. He pursued his film career right up until his arrest on December 8, 1999, while at his grandmother's house near Beverly Hills. At his trial in December 2000, Avery was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Despite his gang affiliation as a committed Blood, a different Avery emerged in prison, that of a devout Christian who the other inmates nicknamed Baby Jesus. Avery found salvation in Dennis Clark's congregation in L.A. County Jail, who had first noticed Avery in the front row during one of his services. Avery was eager to turn his life around, and was soon meeting with the chaplain in his office where they would talk daily about God. Clark said that whenever Avery committed himself to something, he went all in. As with his acting, religion was no different. His faith was real as any man's faith I've ever known, said Clark. With his newfound faith, Avery carried his Bible, with notes scribbled in the margins, into court every day during his December 2000 trial. But it soon became apparent that this Lloyd Avery was not the one being judged, but the venerated off-screen Blood gangster, as well as the on-screen Blood who shot Ricky. When Avery arrived at Pelican Bay in March 2001, he continued with his religious fervor, and even began to preach to other inmates in an attempt to convert them. For some unknown reason, correctional officers decided that Kevin Roby was to receive a cellmate, and perhaps in an act that was born out of some twisted logic, in August 2005 they chose Lloyd Avery. Sensing an opportunity in these new living arrangements, Avery, the devout evangelical, believed he'd been given a quest. I know God has him around me for a reason. He knows very well that I am a devout Christian, and I pray for him to the Lord every day that he gives his life to God. He wrote in a letter to Clark dated August 29. According to prison reports, on the evening of September 4, 2005, a spiritual dispute erupted between Avery and Roby, which turned violent. Roby would later explain, he was pushing his agenda to convert me to Christianity, which led to us fighting. This clash ended with Roby choking a battered Avery unconscious. The vicious beating caused a large volume of blood in his lungs, resulting in his death. Roby placed Avery's body in bed under the covers, and over the course of the following day and half, a total of 11 counts of inmates were made by correctional officers, including a standing count at 4:30 p.m. on the Monday. During each of these counts, Avery was tallied. In the meantime, Kevin Roby ate both his own and Avery's food rations, and spent some of that time writing a flirtatious letter to one of the former actor's pen pals. In his own recollection of the murder, Roby told prison officials he had tied a piece of string around one of Avery's arms and tugged it to imitate movement, much like a marionette, in order to fool guards into believing he was still alive. Shortly before the Tuesday midday count, Roby positioned Avery's body onto a pentagram he drew on the floor of his cell. When correctional officers entered the cell, they found the walls were painted with Avery's blood, as part of a satanic ritual that Roby performed as a warning to God. He would later say, "He, God, is next on the agenda once I accomplish what I want to accomplish in this realm." Kevin Roby was handcuffed by guards, and Avery's body was transferred to the infirmary, where medical personnel attempted to administer CPR. By that time his body was already decomposing, and he was pronounced dead at 12:10 p.m. on Tuesday, September 6, 2005. Avery's family, including his brother Che and mother Linda, doubted the official version of the circumstances surrounding Lloyd's death. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's CDCR listed the cause of death as aspiration of blood, with blunt force trauma as a contributing factor. The Avery family conducted a private autopsy, which stated the cause of death as blunt force trauma complicated by aspiration of blood. It also made mention of the injury to Avery's skull, describing the 1.5-inch abrasion on his temple as suggestive of either a blow due to a flat surface such as a carpenter's hammer or impact on a similar type surface. The mention of a carpenter's hammer led to some, including the Avery family, to believe that it was possible Roby didn't act alone. However, the blunt force trauma from such a weapon would be similar to the type of wounds caused by Roby banging Avery's head on the stainless steel sink in their cell. A later CDCR investigation found no evidence that correctional officers played any part in the death of Lloyd Avery II. Hoping that a trial would provide more answers, the family urged local authorities to file charges against Roby. The Del Notre County District Attorney refused, citing the fact that Roby had both confessed to the crimes and was not eligible for the death penalty. The family appealed to the state attorney general, who were inclined to agree with the local DA's decision. A wrongful death lawsuit was considered, but the civil rights movement NAACP and Johnny Cochran's law firm decided to pass on representing the Avery family. Around this time, the CDCR conducted 2 investigations under the supervision of the California Inspector General Office's Bureau of Independent Review, one into the circumstances of Avery's death, and the other on the conduct of the correctional officers. The report was released in early 2007 and found that the correctional officers failed to follow basic procedures and guidelines, such as removing Avery's body before photographing the crime scene, and most importantly, for failing to notice he had been dead in his cell for 38 hours before his discovery. Following an appeal, 5 officers found guilty of misconduct received disciplinary actions ranging from a 5% pay cut for upwards of 45 days to a 10% pay cut for a 6-month period. When Linda Avery, mother of Lloyd, heard about the officers' punishment, she said, "So they just got a little tap on the hand. Crazy." When contacted in November 2020, the correctional officer who found Avery's body refused to comment, saying, "I have nothing to say about it, man. I'm retired. It's no longer a part of my life." Another correctional officer who had knowledge of the incident and who asked to remain anonymous said that miscounts are not uncommon. "These prisoners are assholes," he said in 2007. "These aren't nice people, so you're trying to get your count done, and there is one person who refuses to stand. Are you going to count him?" he asks. "We like a quiet day. We cherish a quiet day. I know all these officers involved in this case. They didn't do this on purpose. Was it lazy? Sure. Do they have absolute regret? Yes. To me, if there is any mystery here, it's why was Roby taken from a single cell status to being in a double? Who cleared it? Prison officials don't clear it. That's management." That same year, 2007, Pelican Bay administration officials declined to answer questions concerning the matter, citing third-party confidentiality and other individual privacy concerns. Kevin Roby remains incarcerated and continues to sign his letters Satanic Christ, believing himself, in his own words, to be the prophesied killer of God and the rightful ruler of this universe. In letters, he has described how it was necessary to perform 2 rituals over his body in order to fulfill some satanic prophecy. He claims he is not a devil worshipper, but insists he is the Christ of darkness. Roby announced his plans to release a book in September 2020, which he called The Satanic Christ, The Living Word of Darkness, which would contain 66 chapters and 6 sections, with a page count of 999 pages. However, it is unlikely that such a book would find a publisher due to his imprisonment. It appears the passage of time has not diminished Kevin Roby's own faith in his satanic beliefs. On August 11, 2024, an incident occurred at the California Institution for Men (CIM), where inmate Kevin Roby was being held. Located in the city of Chino, San Bernardino County, CIM, which is often referred to as Chino, or Chino Men's, as the locals call the prison, is a male-only facility that holds dangerous inmates such as Roby. At around 3:30 p.m., officers observed Roby exiting his housing unit, wearing only his underwear and no shoes. He reportedly ignored officers' orders to stop and continued to make his way towards the yard. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation (CDCR), Roby was seen on the yard where he yelled he would kill anyone left on the yard and pulled out an inmate-manufactured weapon in a sheath from his boxers. Officers responded immediately, initiating a code I, forming a skirmish line. In retaliation upon seeing this, Roby charged towards the officers, and staff were forced to use physical force, as well as chemical agents to restrain Roby and stop the attack. The report said Roby used the inmate-manufactured weapon to stab an officer on the side of his head. The wounded officer was transported to a medical facility where he was treated for lacerations and effects of the pepper spray used to subdue Roby before being released. As a result of the unprovoked attack, Roby was placed on restricted housing status, with plans to be transferred to another institution. Case 3. A suave and debonair fashionista, Cesare Bonventre, was also a ruthless and dangerous criminal responsible for as many as 20 mob slayings. As a capo regime and made man, he was an influential member of the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 families of the New York City Cosa Nostra. Hailing from Sicily, Cesare Bonventre arrived in America during the 1960s and became a bodyguard to then Bonanno family boss Carmine Galante. In order to gain further power, he betrayed Galante and was rewarded by the new family leadership. But his days were numbered. Bonventre was becoming too powerful and wealthy, and he soon earned the enmity of Joseph Massino. The Bonanno underboss would orchestrate a purge of all rivals within the family, and Bonventre's disappearance in April 1984 was believed to be the end result of this internal power struggle between different factions of the family. It would take almost 20 years for the Bonventre family to get justice for his death. At around midday on July 12, 1979, 5 men sat down to lunch on an open patio at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant at 205 Knickerbocker Avenue in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Amongst them was the acting boss of the Bonanno crime family, Carmine Galante. He was dining with Leonard Coppola, a Bonanno capo, and restaurant owner/cousin Giuseppe Turano, a Bonanno soldier. Galante's Sicilian bodyguards, Baldassare Amato and Cesare Bonventre, were also present. Unusually, the 2 men were wearing leather jackets, despite the fact that it was a hot summer's day. At 2:45 p.m., 3 men wearing ski masks entered the restaurant, walked onto the patio, and opened fire with shotguns and handguns. Galante, Turano, and Coppola were killed instantly, while Amato and Bonventre were left unharmed. Galante had been taken by surprise, with his cigar still in his mouth. The gunmen then ran out of the restaurant. The hit had been organized by the Mafia Commission, who had sanctioned Galante's murder and arranged for Bonventre and Baldo to betray him. A week after the Galante murders, Bonventre was arrested by federal agents, but he was soon released and was never charged with the crime. As the unofficial underboss of the Bonanno family Sicilians, Cesare Bonventre held significant influence within the family, and with Galante's death he would go on to become a powerful capo or made man. Born on January 1, 1951, Cesare Bonventre grew up in Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, and as a young man he was invited to move to New York. It was during the 1960s that the American Mafia began to import young men from Sicily to the United States to work as drug traffickers and hitmen. These Sicilians were known among their American cousin as Zips, due to their fast speech. As a member of the Sicilian faction of the Bonanno family, Bonventre worked as a bodyguard for the unofficial boss Carmine Galante. Several members of his family were involved with organized crime, including his uncle John Bonventre, a former Bonanno underboss, and his cousins Baldassare Baldo, Amato, and the first family boss Joseph Bonanno. The lean and handsome Bonventre was known as the Tall Guy because he stood close to 6 feet 7 inches tall. He was often seen with his shirt unbuttoned with a gold crucifix hanging from his neck. Bonventre was described by one author as having something about him that made him stand out from the other ethnic Italians. He wore stylish clothing, aviator sunglasses, and carried European-made man purses that embodied Italian couture, and frequented clubs such as the Toyland Social Club and the Knickerbocker Avenue area with other Sicilian mobsters. He was also a regular patron of a deli owned by his cousin Baldassare Amato and run by his family, located at 2nd Avenue and 84th Street in Yorkville, New York. The deli would later burn down not long before January 1984, and the Amato family established an apartment building in its place with a sleek Italian cafe and restaurant called Biffy. In 1979, shortly before the assassination of Carmine Galante, Cesare and his cousin Baldassare were arrested for carrying illegal firearms in their car after being stopped by police at the Green Acres Mall in Valley Stream, New York. Galante had an intense rivalry with Carlo Gambino and had ordered the deaths of at least 8 members of the Gambino family in order to take over a massive drug trafficking operation. Galante, who had seized control of the family in 1976, had also angered members of his own family for his refusal to share the proceeds from these lucrative narcotics deals. His death was ordered by the official Bonanno boss Philip "Rusty" Rostelli, who relayed the order to Joseph Massino, a loyal soldier, who passed the request on the Mafia Commission, the controlling board of mafia leaders who sanctioned the hit. Such was the power of the Sicilian faction of the family. Rostelli was required to get approval from the Zips for the murder to go ahead. After the Galante killing, Philip "Rusty" Rostelli became boss of the family once again, despite being incarcerated at the time, while Joseph Massino became underboss. For his part in the Galante murder, Bonventre was promoted from soldier to capo and joined Salvatore Catalano's Brooklyn crew. At the age of 28, Bonventre became the youngest capo in Bonanno family history, and soon became involved in the importation and drug trafficking of heroin from Sicily into New York pizza parlors, known as the Pizza Connection. Whenever he was questioned by law enforcement, Cesare would identify himself as a pizza man from Brooklyn. Although Rostelli was the head of the Bonanno family, it was believed by many that Massino was the real power behind the throne, and he began vying for control over the family with Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano, another Rostelli loyalist capo. Both Massino and Napolitano would eventually join forces against a bigger threat from another faction led by Alphonse "Sonny Red" Indelicato. When Massino got word that the Indelicato crew were attempting to take over the family, he decided to act. The 3 capos, Indelicato, Philip Giacone, and Dominic Trinchera, were invited to a meeting at a Brooklyn social club on May 5, 1981. But the meeting was a trap, and inside waiting for them was 4 gunmen, including Salvatore Vitali and Bonanno-affiliated Montreal boss Vito Rizzuto, who was hiding in a closet ready to ambush them. When the 3 men arrived along with Frank Lino, they were shot to death. Lino escaped unscathed by running out the door. Massino had consolidated his power and prevented another faction from assuming control of the family. Cesare Bonventre had originally supported the planned coup, but switched sides and joined the Rostelli/Massino faction. It is strongly believed that if Bonventre and the Zips had stayed loyal to Indelicato, he would have probably taken over the Bonanno family. The ascension of the Rostelli and Massino leadership resulted in a period of discontent and rivalry within the Bonanno family. As a result, Rostelli and Massino started purging their opponents in the family. This situation was made worse by the Donnie Brasco situation, which led to many Bonanno members being marked for death. Massino had failed to kill Indelicato's son, who vowed revenge for his father's murder. Napolitano assigned Bonanno family associate Donnie Brasco, who he hoped to make a made man, to kill Indelicato. Brasco, however, was in fact an undercover FBI agent named Joseph Pistone, and shortly after the hit was ordered, his assignment was ended and Napolitano was informed of the FBI's infiltration. Massino ordered the deaths of anyone associated with the induction of Brasco into the family. There was a large fallout from the Brasco affair, and by March 1982, Massino was tipped off that the FBI were closing in on him, and he chose to go on the run. In April 1983, Rostelli was paroled, and he and Massino put out a contract on Cesare Bonventre. While still a fugitive, Massino summoned Vitali, Luis Atanasio, and James Tartaglione to his hideout and gave them the order for the hit. Despite Rostelli's position as the official head of the Bonanno family, Massino was considered by most mobsters to be the family's street boss and field commander in all but name, as well as Rostelli's heir apparent. Vitali would later claim that Massino had ordered Bonventre's murder because the Sicilian capo had given him no support when he was in hiding. With Bonventre's Sicilian pedigree, increasing wealth and fearsome reputation, he posed an increasing threat to Massino's leadership. With his control of the Sicilians, the meanest killers in the family, Bonventre held an important position within the family, and was himself capable of outbursts of sadistic violence, being suspected of over 20 murders. Massino warned his fellow conspirators, "He's a very sharp guy. You have to be careful." In April 1984, Bonventre was called to a meeting with Rostelli at a glue factory in Wallington, New Jersey. He was picked up by Vitali and Atanasio and driven to a garage. On the way, Atanasio shot Bonventre twice in the head, but to their surprise he was still alive and began grabbing the steering wheel and trying to crash the car, forcing the two hitmen to fight him off. As Vitali steered into the garage, Bonventre crawled out of the car, and Luis Atanasio killed him on the garage floor with 2 more shots. The task of disposing of Bonventre's corpse was handed to Gabriel and Fanny, who promised Vitali that Bonventre's remains would disappear forever. His body was hacked to pieces and dumped into 3 55-gallon glue drums, which were then moved by the killers to the 4th-floor offices of a trading company in Garfield, New Jersey. Shortly after his death, Bonventre's widow gave birth to their only son. Unaware that Bonventre was dead, he was indicted on April 9, 1984, by a federal grand jury along with 12 other Bonanno members on charges of distributing narcotics through the pizza restaurants, the so-called Pizza Connection case. Despite Fanny's promise, the remains were discovered after a tip-off on April 16, 1984, in a warehouse in Garfield, New Jersey. Cesare Bonventre was later buried at St. Charles Cemetery in Farmingdale, New York. For his part in the hit, Massino had Vitali initiated into the Bonanno family as a made man. Not long after the murder, a government informant claimed that one of Bonventre's killers was Bonanno mobster Cosimo Aiello, who would himself be shot to death in the parking lot of a Clifton, New Jersey restaurant in October 1984. It would be nearly 20 years after the Bonventre murder when federal authorities arrested his killers, Luis Atanasio, Peter Calabrese, and Luis's brother, Robert Atanasio. By that time, Vitali was a government witness and agreed to testify against them. On September 20, 2006, after being convicted of Cesare Bonventre's murder, Luis Atanasio and Calabrese were sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, while Robert Atanasio, who had cleaned up the murder car, received a 10-year sentence. Case 4. During the decade of the 1940s, the city of Los Angeles was fast becoming the cinematic heart of the United States, with its emerging Hollywood district becoming known for producing some of the most iconic films of the 20th century. Yet behind the glamorous era of the handsome leading men and beautiful movie starlets, there existed the dark and dangerous underbelly of this sinful city. Iconic locales such as Sunset Strip, Hollywood Boulevard, as well as other neighborhoods and regions in Los Angeles were fast becoming known for the decadent vice of celebrity scandal and police corruption, gambling and prostitution, as well as organized crime and infamous slayings, all of which would contribute to City of Angels becoming known as the City of Sin. With a cast of characters worthy of a Hollywood film noir crime thriller, some of the most sensational and still unsolved murders were committed on the streets of the largest city in California. Tales of murder, mayhem, political corruption, and celebrity scandal were rife in Los Angeles during the 1940s. News reporters of that period had the habit of naming particularly lurid crimes with a headline-grabbing title, such as the 1944 shooting death of a young waitress, which became known as the Red Ribbon Murder, or the brutal red lipstick murder of an aviatrix in 1947. One of the most ghastly and infamous murders in the history of Los Angeles is that of Elizabeth Short, which became known as the Black Dahlia Murder, and would forever become a symbol of the darker side of the city. At night, the streets of LA were a dangerous place for a young woman, and there were many other unsolved murders around this time period, that of almost 20 women over the course of 8 years, most of whom were committed under similar circumstances, that of a beautiful woman whose life was brutally cut short by an unknown madman who slipped away into the night never to be unmasked. Arriving in LA to visit her sister Latona and her husband, Oswald Lanin, 42-year-old Aura Mae Murray had traveled on June 22, 1943, from Camp McCain in Mississippi, where her sergeant husband was stationed, while she worked at the PX. About 5 days into her visit, the women decided to dancing at a dance hall. These establishments were prevalent all over the world during World War II, and were considered a morale booster for both soldiers and the civilian population. The large dance halls usually had an orchestra, while smaller ones consisted of a three-piece band, and the atmosphere of music and dancing were a celebration to raise the spirits during the war. On the evening of June 27th, Ora and Latona went dancing at the Zenda Ballroom, where they met two men, Preston and Paul. They were invited to take a ride in Paul's flashy blue convertible coupe. However, Preston decided not to join them. The trio stopped by Latona's house so they could pick up her husband, but he begged off, and so Latona stayed with him. It would be the last time she saw her sister alive. He was soon identified as 26-year-old Roger Lewis, aka Lewis Gardner, who also used the name Grant Terry. He was a swindler, who at that time was serving a sentence at Leavenworth for fraud and impersonating a federal officer. He was arraigned for trial over the murder of Ora Murray, which ended in a mistrial. At the onset of the retrial, which was scheduled for December 19, 1944, the charges were dropped at the request of Deputy District Attorney John Barnes. He was however found guilty of grand theft, swindling from his erstwhile fiancée, and was sentenced to between 1 to 10 years at San Quentin. No other suspects were arrested in connection with the murder of Ora Murray, and her murder remains unsolved. As police investigated further, they came across a date-book diary in the bedroom containing the names of servicemen. One particular soldier was thought to have been infatuated with Bauerdorf. He was described as swarthy, and allegedly cut in on Bauerdorf during nearly every dance on the night of her death. This man eventually came forward and was identified as Corporal Cosmo Volpe, who was soon eliminated as a suspect after his alibi checked out. June Ziegler was with Bauerdorf at the canteen on the night prior to the murder, and she mentioned that Bauerdorf dated a serviceman less than a month before her murder. This man was 6'4" and a friend of another serviceman, whose name was frequently mentioned in the diary. According to Ziegler, Bauerdorf remarked that the tall soldier was very much taken with her. However, she did not return his interest and quit going out with him. The soldier was sought for questioning by officers. No one was ever charged with her murder, and the case remains unsolved. Ruth Frances Spaulding was found at her home on 1206 West 2nd Street, having swallowed sleeping tablets in what appeared to be a suicide attempt on May 9, 1945. Transported to Georgia Street Receiving Hospital, the city's main trauma hospital, she died 2 hours later. It was determined by doctors she had died by ingestion of a lethal dose of barbiturates. Her death was investigated by the Los Angeles County coroner, who determined the cause to be suicide. At the time of her death, 27-year-old Spaulding worked as a secretary for Dr. George Hodel, who operated his own medical practice and was head of the county's Social Hygiene Bureau. Shortly after Spaulding's death, Dr. Hodel traveled to China, where he worked with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. In October 1949, Dr. Hodel came under police scrutiny when he was accused of molesting and impregnating his 14-year-old daughter, Tamar Hodel, after which she was given a back-alley abortion. 3 witnesses came forward, 2 of whom admitted to participating in the sex acts. At the widely publicized trial, 2 of the witnesses testified, but the third recanted her earlier testimony and refused to take the stand. Some believed that Hodel had threatened to woman into silence. This resulted in Hodel's acquittal of the sexual assault charges in December 1949, and many believed his daughter had made up the abuse allegations for attention. It was this molestation case that first brought Hodel to the attention of the LAPD detectives investigating the Black Dahlia murder of Elizabeth Short in January 1947. Because of the nature of the crime and the belief that a doctor was involved, Hodel was now considered a potential suspect. He was also interviewed as a suspect in the June 1949 murder of Louise Springer, known as the Green Twig murder. However, no charges were ever brought against him for a lack of evidence linking him to the crime. The LAPD placed him under surveillance from February 18, 1950 to March 27, 1950, by installing 2 microphones in his private Hollywood residence on Franklin Avenue, which were monitored by up to 18 detectives. It was the intention of the surveillance squad to see if Hodel made any insinuating comments about his involvement in the Elizabeth Short's murder. Most of the transcript involves dull conversation, but does include Hodel having sex, talking about money problems, and berating his secretary. On the February 19, 1950, something sinister was recorded. 8:25 p.m., woman screamed. Woman screamed again. It should be noted the woman was not heard before the screams. Later that same day, Hodel was overheard talking to a confidant. Realized there was nothing I could do. put a pillow over her head, and cover her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Expired at 12:59. They thought there was something fishy. Anyways, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. On Wednesday, July 10, 1946, Kenneth Landon, a service station operator, reported his wife as a missing person at the 77th Street Police Station. 36-year-old Gertrude Evelyn Landon had disappeared from her home at 9635 South Hoover Street in South Los Angeles, and initially police suspected the involvement of Mr. Landon as a possible suspect. On Sunday, July 15, 1946, 33-year-old Wilmington shipyard worker Theodore P. Walther was looking through junk at a dump site that was part of the giant gravel pit that recently had become the Chandler Palos Verdes Sand and Gravel Company. There he came upon the half-buried body of a woman, clad only in bra, panties, and shoes, and was wearing a large 22-stone engagement ring, a gold wedding ring, as well as a necklace. Captain J. Gordon Bowers of the Sheriff's Department verified the identity of the victim through fingerprints as that of Gladys Evelyn Landon. Considering the circumstances of the crime, police soon ruled out Kenneth Landon as a suspect in the case. There were many unusual aspects to the murder of Gladys Landon. Her car, a 1933 four-door Plymouth sedan, was missing, and apart from what little she was wearing, there were no other clothes found nearby, indicating that she had been killed somewhere else and driven to the gravel pit. Police ruled out robbery as a motive owing to the presence of the jewelry. Held on July 17th, the coroner's inquest revealed that Landon had died of strangulation, probably sometime before midnight on July 10th. Despite the brutal nature of her death, the coroner found no evidence of sexual assault. Her car would turn up on July 18th, having been abandoned at the corner of Menlo Street and Slauson Avenue, south of Exposition Park in South Los Angeles. Police never found any further evidence in the case. Her killer was never caught, and Mrs. Landon's murder was never solved. Over the years, many have suspected that Landon's killer might have been the same person responsible for the brutal death of Elizabeth Short, and that a vicious serial killer was stalking women on the streets of LA. The murder of Elizabeth Short is perhaps one of the most enduring and infamous crimes in Los Angeles history, with numerous suspects put forward as the possible killer. Many books and films have been made with the intention of explaining the unsolved crime. Dr. George Hodel has been proposed as a leading prime suspect, owing to his own checkered criminal history, and the fact that he is a suspect in other murders of young women around the same time, some of which is suspected of being connected to the Black Dahlia case. In the months leading up to her murder, Short was herself investigating the series of murders in Illinois, known as the Lipstick Murders. It has been suggested that she was close to exposing the real murderer in those crimes, which were attributed to a young man named William Aarons, and that she was killed to prevent her from exposing the truth. But this is just one of many theories for her ghastly death. On February 27, 1947, 41-year-old Terry Tate of 123 North San Pedro Street was arrested on suspicion of the murder of his wife, Mary. She had been found strangled with one of her own stockings in her room at 107 Weller Street, described as a rooming house or hotel. At the inquest, the manager of the rooming house, Asachi Ujiri, testified that he last saw the victim on the Saturday night of January 18th, in the company of an unidentified white male. She was found the following Sunday morning by Ujiri, beaten and strangled. The coroner's jury recommended her husband be held for further questioning, but he was soon released. On July 1, 1947, Oscar Johann Hallgren, a 40-year-old former film technician, was held by police for the Tate murder. 3 witnesses positively identified Hallgren, of 341 West Poplar Street, Compton, as the man seen with Mrs. Tate shortly before her body was found. He had previously been a patient at Moose Lake State Hospital, MN, in 1940. He was released for a lack of evidence and later died in Long Beach, California, in 1976. Sadly, because May Tate was a black woman, her case did not warrant much press coverage in the wake of the Elizabeth Short murder, which occurred several days before. Police then focused on the man last seen with Jean during the hours before her death. Witnesses described how she was with a small man with a dark complexion at the Pan American Bar in West Washington Place. The bartender recalled how the pair left together. However, police were never able to trace the man. Her car was later traced to a parking lot, and witnesses said it had been there since around 3 a.m. on the morning of the murder. Another witness said a man was seen leaving the car at the location. However, this man was never traced either. Soon every lead went cold, and the red lipstick murder faded from the newspapers. 3 years later, during a reinvestigation ordered by the grand jury, detectives came across another suspect. Some 4 months before his brutal murder, the couple hired a painter named George Witt to work on the family home. It was discovered that Jean and George began seeing each other, and Witt would admit they went on several dates. When police questioned him, Witt's behavior aroused suspicion, and it was learned he had burned some clothes and several pairs of shoes around the time of the murder. He reportedly told investigators that he feared becoming a suspect and believed he would be accused of the murder of Jean French once police found out about their affair. It is unknown if the shoes owned by Witt would have been a match or even the same size as those worn by the killer, but he too was found to have a solid alibi and was cleared of any involvement. Those who proposed Dr. George Hodel as a suspect believe he murdered Elizabeth Short, Jean French, and several other women. It is suspected he left the message scrawled in red lipstick on Jean's body as a message to the LAPD, who had investigated him over several crimes including rape and murder. There is also a connection between red lipstick and the Black Dahlia murder, because prior to her death, Elizabeth Short was conducting her own investigation into the Illinois lipstick murders committed between June 1945 and January 1946. However, the suspects cited in the case, including George Witt and George Hodel, wore a larger size shoe than the size 6 or 7 worn by the killer. The case remains unsolved. In 1942, she left the studio and gave up an apartment she had at 1850 North Cherokee Street, while her last permanent residence was 282212 Rowena Street, which she departed from on September 1, 1946. Mrs. Winters told police that her daughter had been addicted to alcohol and that she had been trying to straighten her out. Fearful that her daughter needed help, she would meet with her 3 times a week at hotels and bus stations to give her small amounts of money. Although she had been attempting to find her daughter a room, she continued to be a resident of downtown barrooms and only held occasional jobs as a waitress since leaving the studio. It was also reported that she had a police record. Meanwhile, the possible suspect, Mr. Wickliffe, had an extensive record, with 3 arrests for window peeping, vagrancy and begging in his hometown of Joplin, Missouri, and upwards of 17 arrests in Wichita, Kansas, for vagrancy and loitering. Nothing further came from the investigation, and her murder remains unsolved. Housewife and mother of 3 Mrs. Montgomery was reported missing by her husband, 45-year-old Thomas, on the night she disappeared. He soon came under suspicion and was arrested by police, who believed he had murdered his wife. James Kennedy came forward and identified him as the man seen leaving the victim's car in front of his house at 6112. Hooper Street neighbors of the Montgomerys reported to police that they heard screams in the vicinity of the couple's home on the night of May 2nd, and that the family car had been parked on the driveway. Thomas admitted to detectives that he and his wife had 3 big arguments before she was found dead, but denied killing her. Police tested bloodstains found on 2 pairs of shoes belonging to Dorothy, and found it had been caused by rabbit's blood, which is what Mr. Montgomery claimed as the family kept rabbits. Thomas Montgomery stood trial for his wife's murder and was acquitted for lack of evidence or motive. The Santa Rosa Press-Democrat described 20-year-old Rosenda Mondragon at the time of her death as a Latin beauty. Born in New Mexico, she became married at the age of 17 to 22-year-old Antonio Mondragon. The marriage had been fraught with unhappiness, and on the evening of July 8, 1947, a drunken Rosenda awakened her husband to serve him with divorce papers. They continued to argue into the early morning hours, until she left the family home at 2:30 a.m. Mr. Mondragon would later tell police that he dressed and followed her with the intention of driving his wife to her room at 836S Crocker. However, before he would reach her, a car pulled up alongside and she got in, he said. Reporting at that time was conflicting, with different accounts of what happened given by both the Examiner and the Times. In what would become known as the Red Hibiscus murder, on December 10, 1946, Naomi Tullis Cook was beaten to death with a 5-inch bolt at Lincoln Park. 4 teenagers arrested on suspicion of her death were later released without charge on February 18, 1947. It is unknown if her murder was connected to that of the Cook murder. However, a common theme among the murders of this time was of lone drunk women out walking the streets of L.A. at night. Much like Laura Trelstad, Rosenda Mondragon was out on foot and was picked up by her killer. With a lack of suspects, Antonio Mondragon was picked up police and given a polygraph test, which he passed. With no other suspects, The case soon went cold, and was one of more than 7 that were committed against young women in Los Angeles during the year of 1947. On the morning of February 14, 1948, a woman was found in the crouching position in the backyard of a property at 3997 West Side Avenue. When police arrived, they found she had suffered from head injuries, and she was taken to hospital, where she was identified by her husband Paul as Mrs. Viola Norton of 226 South 3rd Street, Alhambra. Doctors were treating her for a possible skull fracture and deep scalp wounds inflicted by a blunt instrument. Near the crime scene, several doors away in the driveway at 3391 West Side Avenue, police found one of the woman's slippers near a pool of blood, along with her rifled purse. Mrs. Norton told police that on the Friday evening, 2 men in a light blue sedan had abducted her off the sidewalk at around 1:30 a.m. She said she remembered leaving a bar and then fighting with her assailants, who tore at her clothes. She was then beaten, bludgeoned, slashed, dumped for dead just blocks from Elizabeth Short scene. On June 16, 1949, a convertible automobile was found abandoned at 125 West 38th Street. Inside was the decomposing body of Mrs. Louise Springer, who was found in the rear seat of her husband's car. She had been garroted with a length of clothesline that was knotted around her neck, with 2 knots under her left ear. Her face was swollen and almost black, and her brown skirt was tangled around her hips, and her yellow jacket twisted around her body. It was found that her killer had violently driven a 14-inch long, half an inch thick, stick or tree branch into her vagina. In some reports, the stick was also used to sodomize the victim. Some 36 hours before, Louise Springer had been reported missing by her husband. Working as a stylist at a beauty shop, she had finished work shortly before 9 p.m. on the evening of June 13th, and Lawrence Springer had arrived to pick her up from work. He parked in a lot on Crenshaw, located just across the street from the shopping center where his wife worked. On the evening of October 7, 1949, dancer, model, and part actress Jean Spangler left her home in Los Angeles, telling her sister-in-law that she was going to meet with her ex-husband before going to work as an extra on a film set. Spangler was last seen alive at a grocery store several blocks from her home at approximately 6 p.m. It wasn't until 2 days later that police discovered Spangler's tattered purse was discovered in a remote area of Griffith Park, approximately 5.5 miles from her home. Inside was found a letter addressed to an unknown person. It read, "Kirk, can't wait any longer, going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." Because she had recently worked on the film Young Man with a Horn starring Kirk Douglas, he called police to clear his name, telling them he was in Palm Springs at the time, which police accepted. Douglas denied that he knew Spangler. However, later, when interviewed via telephone by the head of the investigating team, Douglas admitted that he had talked and kidded with her a bit on set, but that he had never spent time with her outside of the film production. He gave a formal press statement on October 12th, in which he said, "I told Detective Chief Thad Brown that I didn't remember the girl or the name until a friend recalled it was she who worked as an extra in a scene with me in my picture Young Man with a Horn. Then I recalled that she was a tall girl in a green dress. I talked and kidded with her a bit on the set, but I never saw her before or after that and have never been out with her." Although she had told her sister-in-law she was going to meet with her ex-husband and then work on a film set, detectives asked her ex Dexter Benner. He told them he had not seen her for several weeks. On the night of August 18, 1949, 48-year-old Mimi Boomhoer had arranged to meet her friend, Stella Hunter, for a night out. However, she canceled due to a business meeting and instead went alone to several Hollywood nightclubs. That night Mimi vanished, her whereabouts a complete mystery. Known as fun-loving Mimi to her friends, the widowed Mrs. Boomhoer's late husband had died some 10 years ago, and she lived alone at the couple's upmarket home, a Spanish-style mansion in the middle of Bel Air. With her money dwindling, she began to pawn items to keep up the facade of the previous life she enjoyed with her husband, Novice E. Blumhauer, a linoleum magnate and big game hunter, wealthy and a social gadabout, who always made sure his wife wore large diamonds on her fingers. When police searched her home, they found an uneaten salad at her table, with the lights left on and her front door open, while her car was still in the garage. The last person who had spoken with Mimi was a friend who telephoned on August 18th, between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m., to discuss an approaching social event. Case 5. On an early winter morning, just 4 days after Christmas Day, a local butcher's apprentice discovered a horrific sight at the back of Mellor Street in Bradford, England. There, the body of a young boy was found in an almost indescribable condition. This crime came during the aftermath of the autumn of terror perpetrated by the serial killer, known as Jack the Ripper, and some even suspected the Whitechapel murderer responsible, owing to the dreadful escalation in his own slayings. Although the crimes of the Ripper were gruesome in their savagery, they paled in comparison to the horrendous mutilations inflicted on 7-year-old John Gill in December 1888, which would be the culmination in a year of bloodshed and horror that shocked Victorian society. From August 31st, 1888 to November 9th, 1888, the murderer known as Jack the Ripper would claim the lives of 5 women in what were vicious and gruesome killings. With a sense of heightened fear among the residents of the East End, and no prostitute safe from the blade of this unseen maniac, the police were powerless to stop the Ripper. With each murder, the mutilations grew steadily more depraved and culminated in the dissection of the last victim, Mary Kelly. By early December 1888, the killer had all but stopped his murderous spree and vanished, never to be seen or heard from again. Although these crimes were bloodthirsty and shocking to the moralistic Victorian society, they paled in comparison to the murder of a young boy, whose life was taken by a black-hearted and vile killer who committed unspeakable atrocities. Early on the morning of Thursday, 27 December 1888, 7-year-old John Gill of 41, Thorncliffe Road, Bradford, in the north of England, left his house to accompany local milkman William Barrett on his round. Described by newspaper reports as a bright little fellow and a general favorite, Gill would frequently accompany Barrett and had done many times in the past. Barrett later claimed that the boy had left him before his last call, as the young boy was just a few hundred yards from his home. Despite being so close to his house, John Gill never arrived home. As far as anyone knew, the last definite sighting of him had been at around 8:30 a.m. when he was seen at the top of Thorncliffe Road, sliding on an ice slide with a group of other boys. His parents, their neighbors, and the police searched over the course of the following 2 days, frantically looking for any sign of the young child, but no trace of him was found. Then, at around 7 a.m. on the morning of December 29, 1888, Joseph Burke, a boy employed by the local butcher, went to the stable of his master, Mr. Newbolt, located behind Mellor Street, to yoke up the horse for the day's trading. Having first tidied the stable, Burke went to deposit the horse droppings in the manure tank, when at that moment he spotted a bundle in the corner near the cart shed doors. As described by the Press Association, the boy was found at a spot than which it would be difficult to find a more convenient one for the purpose of placing anything with the view of escaping detection. It is situated in an obscure thoroughfare at the back of Mellor Street. The backs of the houses in the street form one side, and a row of stables and coach houses opposite. In the latter row there is a recess of a remarkable character, formed by 3 sides of the stables, that portion immediately facing a spectator in the street, being occupied by 2 large doors giving entrance to a cart shed. Just at the left there is a receptacle for manure, and there is a space between the head of this place and the wall, and here the body was found. The December 29, 1888 edition of the South Wales Echo went into detail, describing the horrific injuries that had been inflicted upon the body of the young boy. The unfortunate victim had been indescribably mutilated. Both legs were cut off close to the body. The abdomen was slightly open, and the intestines partly extracted. Both ears were cut off, and there were other shocking disfigurements. When found, the limbs were tied to the body. The braces which the deceased had worn were used to bind the limbs to the trunk. The clothes of the boy were then wrapped round the body, the jacket enveloping the parcel. There was a sack found with the body with the name W. Mason, Derby Road, Liverpool, printed upon it, and this the police hope will serve as a clue to the perpetrators of the crime. All efforts to trace W. Mason would ultimately fail. The mutilations inflicted on the victim were contained within the same article of the South Wales Echo, and pondered whether the perpetrator or perpetrators may have been emulating the Whitechapel murderer. The body of the little lad Gill was even more shockingly mutilated than at first reported. Both legs and arms had been roughly chipped off. There were 2 stabs in the left chest. The heart had been torn out entirely and was stuck against the victim's throat. Both boots had been taken off the lad's feet and were pressed into the cavity of the abdomen in the region of the kidneys, whilst the other parts of the body were practically cut away. There was no blood at the place where the body was found, and the belief of the police is that the tragedy was committed sometime during Thursday night, and the body was only removed to the place where it was found late last Friday night. The police theory is that the crime is the act of drunken lads whose imagination had been inflamed by the accounts of the Whitechapel tragedies, and that they attempted an emulation of their worst features. The legs and arms were tied to the body when it was found, and the whole of the remains were wrapped in a coarse cover, making it look like a large oblong parcel. By noon on December 29, 1888, police had made an arrest. The milkman, William Barrett, was arrested on suspicion of having murdered John Gill. In the December 31st, 1888 edition of the Sunderland Daily Echo, Barrett's appearance is described as he stood before the local magistrates. The prisoner Barrett was brought before the magistrates in a private room on Saturday. He is a well-built young man of fresh complexion, aged 23. He has been married 1 year and has 1 child. His character is good, and the people of this district are inclined to believe in his innocence. In a long statement read out by the chief constable, the grounds for detaining the prisoner were given to the court. First and foremost, the prisoner was the last person seen with the boy. Next, it was stated that the boy had been seen with the prisoner, according to a witness, after the time when the prisoner said he left him. The third was that there was a period of nearly half an hour on the Thursday night for which the prisoner could not account for, and it was possible that he might have been at the stable, of which he had charge, during that time. It was found that at stable the floor had recently been swillied with water, and there was also found a sheet, which was stained, and which had been handed to the forensic expert to find if those stains were of blood. At Barrett's house a large knife was found, and when examined was found to fit the 2 primary wounds. When the prisoner first saw this knife he denied any knowledge of it, but he afterwards admitted it was owned by him. Further evidence showed that the prisoner said at first that he knew nothing about the sheet, but afterwards he said his master had given him it for the horse. Barrett was remanded until the Wednesday. According to the Bristol Mercury, in its edition of Monday 31, December 1888, Barrett's wife, nor many of their neighbors were convinced that William had carried out the murder. As to the police inquiries, there is the strong feeling in the neighborhood of Thorncliffe Road that, despite the suspicious circumstances to which the chief constable directed the attention of the magistrates, the prisoner Barrett is guiltless of any attempt to injure the boy. Those who know him best give him an excellent character for steadiness and sobriety, and declare that he is the last man in the world to commit murder. A press representative visited Mrs. Barrett today and found her perfectly tranquil and collected. She said, "I have no doubt whatever of my husband's innocence." On being questioned as to the bread knife, she stated that the police came to the house yesterday and asked to be allowed to examine her cutlery. She showed the detectives where the table knives were kept, and they selected the most formidable one they could and then took it away. She affirms that the bread knife was regularly cleaned with the other cutlery at the end of the week. It wasn't long before people were drawing parallels between the murder of young John Gill and the crimes of still unsolved Whitechapel murders that had been committed throughout the East End over the previous autumn months. On Monday, December 31st, 1888, the Hull Daily Mail reported that the details of the crime allow that in some respects it surpasses, in its terrible character, the murders in Whitechapel. There, the fiend, having killed his victims, proceeded to mutilate their bodies on the spot. Here in Bradford, he takes away the life of an innocent lad, drains every drop of blood out of his body, and then commences the work of cutting it up, finishing his horrible performance by tying the parts together and depositing them in a dark corner 100 yards from the house where the little boy had lived. The paper went on to claim, "One would imagine that the annals of crime, in this or any other country, would have to be searched in vain for the record of a deed worse than this. It is unnecessary to say that the murder of John Gill has created a very great sensation throughout Bradford, and it will be long before the recollection of it has died out. The vicinity of the murder was visited during Saturday and yesterday by some thousands of persons, who stood in groups about the streets discussing the shocking details, expressing sympathy for the bereaved parents, and hoping that the perpetrator of the foul deed may be brought to justice. It then summed up the feelings of local residents that the murder was the work of the Whitechapel fiend. There was a widespread feeling that Jack the Ripper had transferred his operations from the East End to Bradford, and parents were terror-struck lest little John Gill might be only the first of a number of victims to his lust for human blood. By Tuesday, January 1st, 1889, the Daily News reported on what appeared to be another unusual twist in what was proving to be an odd and horrific case. A remarkable story came to the knowledge of the Bradford police sometime on Thursday, on the morning of which the boy John Gill was first missed, and regarding which they have kept the strictest silence. It went on to describe how, on Wednesday night last, a tailor named Cahill of 324 Heaton Road, a thoroughfare in the suburb where the body was found, but about half a mile further from town and in a very isolated position, went to a ball with his wife. Upon his return about 10 o'clock Thursday morning, an hour and a half after the boy was last seen with the milkman Barrett, he found that their home had been entered. The furniture had been pulled about and turned upside down. A number of articles of various kinds had been thrown in a heap upon the table in the living room, and upon another table was a sight which struck him with horror. The story was then narrated by Mr. Cahill himself. A couple of carving knives were placed crosswise upon the table, and upon them was a card, on one side of which was written, "9:30, look out, Jack the Ripper has been," whilst on the other side were the words, "I have removed down to the canal side. Please drop in. Yours truly, Suicide." There was a large tin can full of water found on the same table, and the whole surface of the table was saturated with water. The clock in the living room was stopped, and the fingers indicated the time stated on the card, 9:30. Nothing had been removed from the house, except a bottle of rum. Another bottle of rum had been removed from the cupboard, and some of its contents had been poured into 2 glasses, which were left upon the table almost empty. Mr. Cahill has been compelled to obtain another house, the shock of the discovery having so unnerved his wife that she will not stay in the house without constant company. Over the course of several days, from January 9th, 1889, William Barrett appeared before magistrates in Bradford Police Court, as the evidence against him was presented and evaluated. On Friday, January 11th, 1889, a decision by the court had been reached. Mr. Armitage, the chairman of the magistrates, announced that, having carefully considered every point of the evidence against William Barrett, they were unanimously of the opinion that no prima facie case could be made out, and the prisoner would, therefore, be discharged. The Daily News reported on January 12, 1889, that there was a loud and prolonged applause in court, and when Barrett soon afterwards left the building and drove off in a cab, he was followed for some distance by a cheering crowd. In the evening, on his arrival at Cunla, his native village, he was publicly feted. With the acquittal of William Barrett, the murderer, or murderers, of young John Gill were never brought to justice, and the crime has remained unsolved. The passage of time, some 130+ years, has done nothing to dampen the horror of the atrocity, which surpasses even the most gruesome of Jack the Ripper's crimes. Despite numerous attempts, the John Gill murder has never been officially linked to the Whitechapel murders. Patricia Cornwall, for example, has claimed that the crime is the work of her prime suspect, Walter Sickert, but the most likely outcome is that it was not connected to the crimes of Saucy Jack. For the little boy who met such a horrible and sad end, there is little hope that justice will be served for either him or his ancestors. Case 6. With the release of Robert Graysmith's 1986 book Zodiac, the public became aware of 2 potential suspects who had been investigated as part of the hunt for the mysterious serial killer. The names of these suspects, Robert Hall Starr and Donald Jeff Andrews, were however pseudonyms, used to protect the identity of these innocent citizens, Arthur Lee Allen and Rick Marshall, both of whom had yet to be charged with any crimes connected with the Zodiac case. Starr would later be revealed to be Arthur Lee Allen, one of the more promising suspects for whom there was a startling amount of evidence pointing to his guilt. In contrast, Andrews, who was unmasked as Richard Reed Marshall, was an avid cinema enthusiast and projectionist who would be connected largely through circumstantial evidence, and who would become a reluctant but albeit permanent suspect in the unsolved serial murder case. Despite numerous connections with the Zodiac case, Rick Marshall would prove to be somewhat of a disappointing suspect. The information contained in Graysmith's 1986 book was revealed to be an embellished mix of fact and fiction about the suspect known as Donald Jeff Andrews, which would only serve to contribute to the confusion surrounding Marshall. Although there are many facts in the case that point towards his guilt, most of those are considered tenuous at best. Retired Zodiac investigator Ken Narlow has commented about the man who was often cited as his favorite suspect, saying that Marshall makes good reading but is not a very good suspect in my estimation. With passage of time, the possibility that Marshall/Andrews could be the notorious Zodiac killer has diminished, so that many amateur Zodiac investigators consider the evidence against him mostly coincidental or speculative, but he has and most likely always will continue to remain on the list of potential suspects. While Charlie Chan is traveling to San Francisco by plane, a friend of Charlie, novelist Paul Essex, dies aboard the aircraft after receiving a radiogram warning him not to ignore Zodiac. This sends Charlie Chan, played by Sidney Toler, into another puzzling mystery set on San Francisco's Treasure Island during the Golden Gate International Exposition. It is possible the killer took his inspiration for the Zodiac name from this movie, wishing to portray himself as a mysterious villain who outsmarts police detectives. However, the old movie connections may have begun with the 1932 RKO production of The Most Dangerous Game, based upon the 1924 short story by Richard Connell. The book and film told the story of General Zaroff, a man who would hunt humans for sport on a deserted island. When the Zodiac Killer began his campaign of terror against the residents of the San Francisco Bay Area in July and August of 1969, he mailed a 3-part cryptogram to 3 Bay Area newspapers. The basic design comprises a circle with a cross centered in the middle, much like the design of a shooting target. A radio ham enthusiast with a knowledge of electrics, Marshall would keep in contact with other radio aficionados, even inviting some listeners to his home. Those who accepted his invitation thought his behavior odd, and owing to suspicious comments made over his ham radio, some suspected he might be the Bay Area Killer. Indeed, much of the incriminating evidence against Marshall comes from a police report compiled in 1976 from the testimony of a suspicious informant, but was mostly based on erroneous information about the crimes and hearsay. He was apparently ambidextrous, something many believed Zodiac to be, and according to the report, he would often use a black felt tip pen, much like the Zodiac. However, the Zodiac used a blue felt tip pen to write most of his letters, information that many casual readers might not have been familiar with. He allegedly once told an acquaintance he had found something much more exciting than sex, and was known to possess a collection of pornographic literature. Another link to Marshall is based on hearsay, specifically that he allegedly owned a Royal typewriter, the same that was used to type 2 carbon copies of the confession letter which detailed the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, one of which was sent to the Riverside Enterprise, the other to the Riverside Police on November 29, 1966. Based on some of these rumors, Marshall agreed to be interviewed by Zodiac investigating detective Ken Narlow, but he strongly denied being the Zodiac Killer. Despite this, speculation over his involvement would continue to circulate in certain quarters that Rick Marshall may have had an accomplice in the Zodiac crimes, which included Richard Gaikowski, who also enjoyed a passion for classic films, and his running of the Roxy Theater in the Bay Area. Officer Donald Falk, who observed the suspect hardly 3 minutes later on Jackson Street, described an individual between 35 and 45 years of age. Then just 2 further minutes later, eyewitnesses overlooking the Julius Kahn playground, probably from the houses in Spruce Street, stated the man was about 40. All of these eyewitnesses gave almost identical descriptions of clothing, weight, hair color, style, and the wearing of glasses. His birth date of March 13, 1926, would make him around 43 years of age in 1969, and the average age of 40 given by witnesses matches closely with the age of Richard Marshall at that time. By the early 1970s, Marshall was working as an engineer for San Francisco Bay Area radio station KTIM. The Exorcist letter, widely believed to be the last authenticated correspondence from the Zodiac Killer, was mailed on January 29, 1974 after a 3-year hiatus by the killer. The communication would yet again finish with a veiled threat that included strange Oriental-style characters at the foot of the correspondence, said to marry up closely to ones used on KTM call letters. There is a tentative link between the Exorcist letter and Marshall's alternate name he was born under and often used. The Exorcist letter contains the phrase, "Signed yours truly." He plunged himself into the billowy wave, and an echo arose from the suicide's grave, "Tit Willow, Tit Willow, Tit Willow." It has been considered that the paraphrasing of the Mikado verse "Tit Willow" after the author signed, "Yours truly," was indicative of an author who was pointing out that his identity was contained within the verse. The verse is about a dicky bird singing "Willow, Tit Willow, Tit Willow," even containing the line, "Now I feel just as sure as I'm sure that my name isn't Willow, Tit Willow, Tit Willow." Richard Marshall was born Joe Don Dickey. On June 19, 1970, Sergeant Richard Radtick was gunned down by 3 shots from a .38 caliber revolver, a point-blank range, through the driver's side window of his vehicle, while in the process of writing out a parking ticket. He was sat in his patrol car near 643 Waller Street, San Francisco, in the Lower Haight District, located just 450 feet from the home of Rick Marshall at 143 Scott Street. The Zodiac Killer would later claim this murder on June 26, 1970, when he mailed the button letter to the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper. He also occupied a residence at 2821 Bush Street, less than 1 mile from the site of the murder of Paul Stine. Marshall would later move to Front Street, San Rafael in Marin County, and had lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for 20 years, between 1969 and 1989. The poster had been designed either by Marshall or his close associate Bob Vaughn. In the 2007 movie Zodiac, directed by David Fincher, the authorship of this poster is brought up in conversation with Vaughn, played by Charles Fleischer, who confesses it was his handwriting that adorned the poster. This particular scene provides one of the film's most memorably tense moments when Robert Graysmith, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, realizes he could possibly be alone inside the killer's home. This is later played to great effect when Graysmith/Gyllenhaal ventures alone with Vaughn into his basement on the pretext of finding some old files, and hears what sound like unsettling footsteps in the apparent empty house above. Vaughn reassures him they were alone, before Graysmith makes his escape. Robert Graysmith claims this encounter with Bob Vaughn did actually take place as depicted in the Zodiac movie. Vaughn was a professional organist who played in silent movie theaters, turning up at the San Bruno Avenue Theater in 1968, as well as playing at the Port Theater where Rick Marshall worked in 1974, along with the Roxy Theater in San Francisco. Born in San Francisco on February 8, 1911, was a theater organist from an early age, having played at many venues including the Avenue Theater at 2650 San Bruno Avenue, San Francisco, situated just off U.S. Route 101, approximately 4 miles south of the Mason and Geary Street intersection, and a 7-mile drive to the Washington and Cherry Street intersection. He was the accompaniment to many movies in the silent film era, dating back as early as 1927, before the work eventually dried up, precipitated by the inevitable arrival of the talking film. He was subsequently forced into a career change, working for the Immigration and Naturalization Service for 30 years, which dealt with checking and evaluating people at an official port of entry, as well as assessing applications for permanent residency. By the early 1960s, he had moved back to San Francisco, working alongside Rick Marshall, a projectionist at the Avenue Theater, where Bob Vaughn excelled as a pipe organist. When the Avenue Theater ceased operating in 1984, Bob Vaughn would continue, performing at the Castro Theater at 429 Castro Street, the UC Theater at 2036 University Avenue, and the Town Theater at 1433 The Alameda, San Jose, where he stayed until 1999. Vaughn died at the age of 90 in Bakersfield, California on January 4, 2002. He would briefly be considered a Zodiac suspect. However, there is little evidence that connects him with the crimes. When the first murders occurred on December 20th, 1968 at Lake Herman Road, Bob Vaughn would have been 57 years of age, too old to be the Zodiac Killer based on eyewitness testimony, and as a result, he was never regarded as a credible suspect by law enforcement. Yet his name would still appear on many Zodiac discussion boards based on his association with Rick Marshall. Ken Narlow, one of the lead Zodiac detectives, investigated Rick Marshall on account of the apparent fascination the Zodiac Killer had with the Mikado and the silent movie connection, but ultimately concluded that Rick Marshall was not a viable suspect. Marshall would also be the subject of an FBI investigation, but his records were expunged in 1993, and nothing remains from the case files. His handwriting, although a close match, was not enough to warrant charges. If some of the fingerprints held on file are the actual prints of the killer, such as the bloody partial fingerprint retrieved from the left dividing panel on Paul Stine's taxicab, then Rick Marshall was correctly discounted as a suspect after his fingerprints failed to match. Although other suspects in the Zodiac case are more promising than Rick Marshall, he has remained a potential candidate because of the many similarities between the brutal serial killer and this mild-mannered silent movie connoisseur. Case 7. Known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, and the Boogie Man, Albert Fish was the personification of nightmares. In November 1938, Mrs. Delia Budd of Manhattan received an anonymous letter claiming responsibility for the disappearance of her young daughter, who had vanished some 6 years previously. The letter described how the kidnapper had visited the Budd family home, and how 10-year-old Grace had agreed to go with him to a birthday party. When the young girl failed to return, the Budds soon realized she had been taken. The letter presented a terrifying picture of the author's intentions and the gruesome fate that awaited Grace Budd. This letter would, however, prove to be the killer's undoing and lead detectives straight to him. Albert Fish was the quintessential boogeyman, the stuff of nightmares for children and parents alike. A child rapist, serial killer, and cannibal, Fish confessed to other crimes but was suspected of the unsolved murders of many more children who vanished. After his trial for the Budd murder, Fish was executed at Sing Sing for his unspeakable crimes. On May 25, 1928, 18-year-old Edward Budd placed a classified ad in the Sunday edition of the New York World. Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. The enterprising young man was determined to make something of himself and escape the desperate poverty of his parents. A strapping young man who was eager to work and contribute to the well-being of his family. Budd had longed to work in the country where the air was fresh and clean, so he could escape the dirty, foul-smelling, overcrowded city in which he shared a miserable tenement with his father, mother, and 4 younger siblings. Some 3 days later, on May 28, Edward's mother, Delia, a large mountain of a woman, answered the door to an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Frank Howard. He said he was a farmer from Farmingdale, Long Island, and wanted to interview Edward about a job. Mrs. Budd instructed her 5-year-old daughter Beatrice to get her brother at his friend's apartment, and the old man beamed at her and gave her a nickel for her trouble. During the time they waited for Edward to return, Delia Budd took the chance to get a better opinion of the old man, who would be her son's prospective employer. She was humming a song, and coming straight from church, she still wore her Sunday clothes. White silk confirmation dress, white silk stockings, and string of creamy pearls made her look older than her 10 years. Her huge brown eyes and dark brown hair contrasted with her very pale skin and pink lips. She was a really pretty young girl. Like most men who came face to face with the beautiful Gracie, Frank Howard couldn't take his eyes off the radiant young girl. As he handed her a huge wad of bills, he said, "Let's see how good a counter you are." The impoverished Budds were shocked by the sight of so much money that this old man was carrying in his pocket. $92.50, she declared in short order. "What a bright little girl," Mr. Howard said, giving her 50 cents to buy candy for herself and her little sister Beatrice. The kindly old man then said he would come back later in the evening to pick up the 2 boys, and gave them $2 to go to the movies. First he had to go to a birthday party that his sister was throwing for one of her children. As he was about to leave, he invited Gracie to go with him to his niece's birthday party. He told her mother he would take good care of her and make sure that little Gracie was home before 9 o'clock that evening. When Delia asked where Mr. Howard's sister lived, he replied that she resided in an apartment house at Columbus and 137th Street. Delia was hesitant, unsure that she should let her go, but Albert Sr. convinced her that it would be good for Gracie. "Let the poor kid go. She don't see much good times." With that, Delia helped Gracie put on her good coat and her gray hat with the streamers, and followed her daughter and Mr. Howard outside and watched them walk down the street and disappear. That first evening there was no word from Mr. Howard and no sign of little Gracie. Her parents endured a torturous and sleepless night with no message from their beautiful daughter. The next morning, they sent Edward down to the police station to report his sister's disappearance. Police Lieutenant Samuel Dribbin had nothing but bad news that day for the Budds. When detectives arrived the next day to investigate the disappearance of the Gaffney boy, they refused to believe the 3-year-old witness, who stuck to his simple yet sinister explanation. At first they suspected the young boy had wandered outside into some of the factory buildings into the neighborhood, or possibly fallen into the Gowanus Canal located just a few blocks away. A search was organized by people from the community, and the canal was dredged, but they found no sign of Billy Gaffney. With little in the way of leads, police were soon obliged to listen to what the 3-year-old witness who gave them a description of the Boogie Man. He said he was a slender old man with gray hair and a gray mustache. Because police had paid little attention to this, they failed to connect it to a previous crime that had been committed by the Gray Man several years earlier. On July 14, 1924, 8-year-old Francis McDonald was playing on the front porch of his home in the pastoral Charlton Woods section of Staten Island. His mother, Anna McDonald, sat close by and was nursing her infant daughter when she saw a frail elderly man with gray hair and mustache standing in the middle of the street. As she looked at the strange, shabby old man, he stood staring and constantly clenched and unclenched his fists while mumbled to himself. He then tipped his dusty hat to her and disappeared down the end of the street. The same old man was seen again later that afternoon, watching Francis and 4 other boys play ball. He eventually called Francis over to him, as the other boys continued to play. A few minutes later, both the old man and Francis were nowhere to be seen. That same afternoon, a neighbor noticed a young boy that looked like Francis walking into a wooded area with an elderly gray-haired tramp behind him. His disappearance was not noticed until the boy missed dinner, and his father, a policeman, organized a search of the area. In the woods under some branches, they found the boy. He had been horribly assaulted, with his clothes torn from his body, and he had been strangled with his own suspenders. The young lad had been beaten so horrifically that police doubted that the tramp responsible could have really been as old and frail as he looked. The beating was so extensive and severe that they thought the old tramp might have had an accomplice who had the strength to commit such a heinous crime. Manhattan police photographers were soon on the scene, along with fingerprints experts, and a search was undertaken by some 250 plainclothesmen. This huge manhunt produced several potential suspects, however none that looked like the gray-haired, mustached old tramp. Anna McDonnell would never forget his face, which was forever imprinted in her memory. He told detectives. He came shuffling down the street, mumbling to himself, making queer motions with his hands. I'll never forget those hands. I shuddered when I looked at them, how they opened and shut, opened and shut, opened and shut. I saw him look toward Francis and the others. I saw his thick gray hair, his drooping gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded and gray. Despite the massive search efforts of the police and the community, it appeared the suspect, known as the Gray Man, had simply vanished into thin air. In September 1930, a suspect was arrested in the Budd murder. Police arrested 66-year-old Superintendent Charles Edward Pope, who had been accused of the crime by his own wife. Few would have believed such a letter was genuine. Those who read it thought it had to be the ravings of some sick, perverted crank. But Detective King soon realized that the details of the author's meeting with the Budds and Grace were accurately described. It was also discovered that the handwriting on the letter was identical to the letter the elderly kidnapper had written for the Western Union Messenger 6 years earlier. Upon closer inspection, the envelope contained an important clue, a small hexagonal emblem that had the letters NYPCBA, which stood for the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. An emergency meeting of the members was held, with the cooperation of the president of the association. Meanwhile, detectives checked out the handwritten membership forms, looking for any handwriting similar to Frank Howard's. Detective King proceeded to ask the members, all of whom had passed the handwriting test, to report anyone who had taken the association's stationery. Soon enough, a young janitor came forward, admitting that he had taken a couple of sheets of paper and a few envelopes. He said he had left the stationery in his old rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street. He planned to lure him to a remote location, restrain him and cut off his penis, leaving him to bleed to death. When he saw the strapping young Edward and his friend Willie, Fish was convinced he could overpower the two of them, and evidently had a lot of experience in that with his previous crimes. Upon leaving the Budd house the first time, Fish had purchased the tools he would use to murder and mutilate Edward Budd and his friend Willie. He bought a cleaver, saw and butcher knife, and wrapped up these implements of death into a bundle which he left at a newsstand before he went to the Budd home for the second and last time. It was only after seeing young Gracie and knowing that it was she he desperately wanted to kill that he changed his mind and altered his plans. When he left that day with the unsuspecting young child, he stopped back at the newsstand to pick up his bundle before taking a train to the Bronx and then to the village of Worthington in Westchester. For his child companion, he only bought a one-way ticket. As Gracie had only twice in her life been out of the city, she was excited by the 40-minute ride into the countryside, which was an adventurous treat for her. No questions were asked about the cannibalism aspect of the letter, and neither was this information volunteered by the prisoner. The police may have considered it too insane to be true, or perhaps they were already thinking about a future trial, and that including such horrific details about cannibalism could bolster the inevitable defense case for insanity. That night the capture of Albert Fish had leaked to the newspapers, and soon reporters descended on the Budd apartment with the news. Shortly afterwards, Mr. Budd and his son Edward were driven to the police station by Detective King to help identify Fish as the man who took Grace. Edward did more than identify Fish, and threw himself at the old man. "You old bastard! Dirty son of a bitch!" Surprised at Fish's lack of emotion, Mr. Budd asked him, don't you know me?" "Yes," Fish answered politely. "You're Mr. Budd." In response, Mr. Budd said, "And you're the man who came to my home as a guest and took my little girl away," with tears in his eyes. Albert Fish was facing indictments in Manhattan and Westchester County. With Albert Fish in jail, police got a major break in one of their unsolved murder cases. During the initial investigation in the disappearance of Billy Gaffney, the police suspected he might have been murdered by serial killer Peter Kudzanowski, who operated at the same time an area as Fish and was responsible for the murders of 3 children. He was eventually ruled out as suspect in the Gaffney case. After his capture, the motorman on the Brooklyn trolley line saw a picture of Fish in the newspaper and came forward to identify him as the nervous old man that he saw on February 11, 1927. Joseph Meehan, the retired motorman, said Fish was the man he saw trying to quiet the little boy sitting with him on the trolley. As he watched the two carefully, the little boy, who didn't have a jacket or coat, was crying for his mother continuously and had to be dragged on and off the trolley by the old man. The little boy, it would turn out, was identified as the abducted Billy Gaffney. Presented with this evidence, Fish admitted to his involvement in the death of Billy Gaffney and described the unspeakable things he did to him. Around 1919, Fish had stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. He intentionally chose people who were either mentally handicapped or African American as his victims, explaining that he assumed these people would not be missed. He would claim to have occasionally paid boys to procure other children for him, who he would torture, mutilate, and murder with his implements of hell: a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. Fish went to Staten Island on July 11, 1924, and there came across 8-year-old Beatrice Keel playing alone on her parents' farm. He offered the young girl money if she would go and help him look for rhubarb. As she was about to leave the farm, her mother spotted the old man and chased Fish away. He left but returned later to the Keel's barn, where he tried to sleep but was discovered by Beatrice's father and forced to leave. Several days later, Mr. Keel came forward after seeing Albert Fish's photograph. The man said that Fish was the man who had tried to lure his then 8-year-old daughter into the woods not far from where Frances O'Donnell was murdered 3 days later in 1924. He described the man as a slender old man with gray hair and a gray mustache. His mother was held to be very queer and was said to hear and see things. One paternal uncle suffered from a religious psychosis and died in a state hospital. A half-brother also died in a state hospital. A younger brother was feeble-minded and died of hydrocephalus. A paternal aunt was considered completely crazy. A brother suffered from chronic alcoholism. A sister had some sort of mental affliction. His own perverse nature was considered unique in the annals of psychiatric and criminal literature. Sadomasochism directed against children, particularly boys, took the lead in his sexually regressive development. Fish told him, "I always had a desire to inflict pain on others and to have others inflict pain on me. I always seemed to enjoy everything that hurt." Fish would confide in Dr. Wortham his long history of preying on children. At least 100, Fish claimed. He would bribe them with money or candy, and usually chose African American children because he believed that the police did not pay much attention when they were hurt or missing. In an effort to evade capture, he never went back to the same neighborhood, and said that he had lived in at least 23 states, and in each one he had killed at least one child. Sometimes he lost his job as a painter because he was suspiciously connected to these dead or mutilated children. He explained about a compulsion to write obscene letters, and did so frequently, such as the one sent to the Budd family. According to Dr. Wortham, they were not the typical obscene letters based on fantasies and daydreams to supply a vicarious thrill. They were offers to practice his inclinations with the people he wrote his graphic suggestions to. Dr. Wortham understandably had some initial concerns about whether or not Fish was lying to him, especially when he told the psychiatrist that he had been sticking needles into his body for years in the area between the rectum and the scrotum. He told of doing it to other people too, especially children. At first, he said, he had only stuck these needles in and pulled them out again. Then he had stuck others in so far that he was unable to get them out, and they stayed there. He was x-rayed by the doctor, and as described, there were at least 29 needles in his pelvic region. Wortham said experiences with excreta of every imaginable kind were practiced by him, actively and passively. He took bits of cotton, saturated them with alcohol, inserted them into his rectum, and set fire to them. He also did that with his child victims. It was in January 1917, when his wife left Fish for John Straube, a handyman who boarded with the Fish family. Fish told a newspaper that when his wife left him, she took nearly every possession the family owned. When Fish was around the age of 55, he started to experience hallucinations and delusions, and once wrapped himself in a carpet, saying that he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. He had visions of Christ and his angels. He began to be engrossed in religious speculations about purging himself of iniquities and sins, atonement by physical suffering and self-torture, human sacrifices. He would go on endlessly with quotations from the Bible all mixed up with his own sentences, such as, "Happy is he that taketh thy little ones and dasheth their heads against the stones." He believed that God had ordered him to mutilate and castrate little boys, something he had done a number of times. Based on his confessions, it was obvious that Fish was suffering from some religious psychosis. Albert Fish told Dr. Wortham that his children had seen him, hitting himself on his nude body with a nail-studded paddle until he was covered with blood. They also saw him stand alone on a hill with his hands raised, shouting, "I am Christ." One of those prosecution alienists was the head of the psychiatric hospital where Fish had been detailed for observation a couple of years after the Bud and other murders, and where he had been judged both harmless and sane. On March 11, 1935, the trial of Albert Fish began in White Plains, New York, in the court of Justice Frederick P. Close. Charged with the premeditated murder of Grace Budd, he was defended by attorney James Dempsey, while the prosecution was led by Chief Assistant, District Attorney Elbert F. Gallagher. Defense attorney Dempsey focused primarily on his client's strange life and the self-flagellation with nail-studded paddles and needles that he claimed to have indulged. He then brought up Fish's competence as a father and his love for his children. In spite of all these brutal, criminal, and vicious proclivities, there is another side to this defendant. He has been a very fine father. He never once in his life laid a hand on one of his children. He says grace at every meal in his house. In 1917, when the youngest one of his 6 children was 3, his wife left him. And from that time down until shortly before the Grace Budd murder in 1928, he was a mother and father to those children. In his closing remarks, he reminded the jury that it was up to the prosecution who had to prove that a man who killed and ate children was sane. Testimonies were made by Grace's parents and brother Albert, Jr., and Dempsey was determined to point out that both Albert, Sr. and Delia gave their consent to Grace going to a birthday party with Fish. When it came time for Albert Sr. to testify, he was overcome with emotion and began to weep loudly. By the 3rd day of the trial, a box of Grace Budd's remains was brought into the courtroom as evidence, despite the strenuous objections of the defense attorney. Meanwhile, Detective King described to the court, from Fish's confession, how the girl was killed. At one point during, and in what was a very dramatic moment, Gallagher reached into the box and held out the small skull of the dead girl. Dempsey sought a mistrial. He then focused on the cannibalism claims as a central part of the insanity defense, and it became clear that he was trying to establish that Fish had eaten parts of the girl's body, something that no sane person would do. This proved unsuccessful in establishing and proving that Fish actually did what he said he did with her body. During the process, Fish appeared to be completely indifferent, although, at one point, he expressed to his attorney that he had a desire to live because God still has work for me to do. Several of Fish's children took the stand to testify to his bizarre behavior of self-flagellation and sticking needles in his body, as well as his religious delusions. But they also testified that he was a good father who always provided for them, and he never subjected to physical abuse. To further demonstrate Fish's strange behavior, he called forth to the stand a woman who had been the recipient of several obscene letters from Albert Fish. The courtroom was cleared of women as Dempsey read the obscene correspondence. Another defense witness called by Dempsey was Mary Nicholas, Fish's 17-year-old stepdaughter. She went on to describe how Fish taught her and her brothers and sisters a game he invented. He went into his room, and he had a little pair of trunks, brown trunks, that he put on. He put those on and came out into the front room, and he got down on his hands and knees, and he had a paint stick that he stirred paint with. He would give the stick to one of us, and then he would get down on his hands and knees, and we would sit on his back, one at a time, with our back facing him, and then we would put up so many fingers, and he was to tell how many fingers we had up, and if he guessed right, which he never did, why we weren't supposed to hit him. Sometimes he would even say more fingers than we really had, and if he never guessed right, why, we would hit him as many fingers as we would have up. She said that sometimes a hairbrush was used instead of the paint stick, and also stuck pins under his fingernails in front of the children. Towards the end of the trial, Dempsey eventually had a chance to attack the prosecution alienists. Dr. Charles Lambert, after a 3-hour interview with Fish, pronounced him a psychopathic personality without a psychosis. Dempsey questioned Lambert over this. Assume that this man not only killed this girl but took her flesh to eat it. Will you state that that man could for 9 days eat that flesh and still not have a psychosis? Lambert answered, well, there is no accounting for taste, Mr. Dempsey. Dempsey then persisted. Tell me how many cases in your experience you have seen people who actually ate human feces. Lambert remarked casually, oh, I know individuals prominent in society, one in particular that we all know who used it as a side dish in his salad. Unperturbed, Dempsey got much further with one of the other defense alienists, who testified that he could see signs of psychosis in Fish's behavior. The trial lasted for 10 days, and it took the jury less than an hour to reach its verdict. Case 8. A series of child abductions during the late 1980s and early 1990s were attributed to a single offender who caused terror in the communities of Melbourne. An assault that occurred in 1987 would soon be linked to the abductions of 2 young girls during separate incidents, as well as a 3rd child who was snatched and later murdered. In 1994, Australian police launched Operation Spectrum, a dedicated investigation with the main task of apprehending the kidnapper and suspected murderer, who the media had nicknamed Mr. Cruel. Because of a lack of evidence, this investigation failed to identify the masked home invader, and it would be over 20 years before a fresh inquiry was undertaken. Task Force Apollo, launched in 2010, conducted a review of the original investigation and utilized new technology and investigative techniques in a bid to capture the dangerous child rapist and killer who had terrorized the northern and eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Police had previously investigated a number of other sexual assaults committed against women, young girls, and even a young boy. The first had taken place on an unknown date in February 1985, when a man abducted a 14-year-old girl from her Hampton home at around 9 p.m. The masked intruder drove her to a vacant building site and sexually assaulted her, before dumping her at Moorabbin Bowl, a 10-pin bowling outlet on the Nepean Highway. Several months later, in July 1985, a 14-year-old boy was abducted from his Hampton residence at 8:25 p.m. He was taken to an unknown location and imprisoned for just over 3 hours, during which he was sexually assaulted, before being released in Caulfield South at 11:45 p.m. Both of these attacks were mentioned by the Herald Sun in 2016 to mark the anniversary of the Carmine Chan abduction. It is currently unknown why police suspect these incidents are linked to the later Mr. Cruel abductions. 3 other attacks possibly attributed to Mr. Cruel occurred in December 1985. The first of which took place on December 4th, when a 30-year-old woman was tied up and raped in her home at an unknown address in Warrandyte by a man wearing a balaclava and armed with a sawn-off shotgun who appeared from a walk-in wardrobe while the woman was getting ready for bed. A further attack occurred 2 days later on December 6th, when a woman in her 30s was bound and raped in her home in Don Vale by a man armed with a long-barreled handgun and a rusty revolver. It would be almost 2 years before the resident of Melbourne would suffer the nightmare of Mr. Cruel. The area of Canterbury lies just on the outskirts of Melbourne, to the west of Ringwood and south of Lower Plenty. Another suburban area that is situated much closer to the centre of Melbourne. It was home to many Australian politicians and public officials, as well as the wealthy English Linus family, who were renting a house along the well-to-do Monomeath Avenue. The family had moved to Australia for business purposes and were planning on moving back to the UK within the next few days. Ironically, the family had moved to the Melbourne area of Canterbury to raise their children in the relative safety of the leafy suburban neighbourhood. This illusion of safety was shattered on the night of July 3, 1990, when their home became the scene of the next abduction. The Linus parents, Brian and Rosemary, were attending a farewell party being thrown for them, as the family were planning to move back home, and left their 2 daughters home alone for several hours. Back at Monomeath Avenue shortly before midnight, a masked intruder roused 15-year-old Fiona and 13-year-old Nicola from their sleep, and in angry and commanding threats, ordered Nicola into another room. He ordered her to get her school uniform, which she wore when attending the Presbyterian Ladies' College, while he tied her sister to her own bed. As the man was armed with a knife and a handgun, the two girls did as they were told out of fear of their lives. The masked man told Fiona that her father would have to pay $25,000 if he wanted the safe return of her sister, and together with Nicola he fled the home, stealing the family's rental car, which was parked in the driveway. He drove for around a kilometer before parking the rental car, and presumably transferring to another parked car that he had previously prepared. This would appear to confirm that the suspect lived in the surrounding vicinity, and most likely near Tullamarine Airport, and more precisely within its direct flight path. For the first time, detectives were in possession of eyewitness details about the suspect, and had a rough idea of the interior of home, the type of car he drove, and most importantly where he lived. As part of this refocused investigation, Victoria Police searched houses in Keeler East, Niddry, Airport West, Keeler Park, and Essendon North. Police were now desperate to apprehend the individual known as Mr. Cruel, because it would be only a matter of time before he struck again. Less than a year later, another young girl would be snatched by the masked phantom. One of the many potential leads pursued by police was the possibility that Mr. Cruel had committed other crimes, perhaps even in another continent. Crimes similar to the modus operandi of the abductions were investigated and discounted as having no link. One such offender was the unsolved American case of the East Area Rapist, EAR, who was suspected of being responsible for committing upwards of 50 attacks in Northern California from June 1976 to July 1979. In 2001, the East Area Rapist crimes were linked by DNA to a series of murders committed by a serial killer in Southern California, known as the Original Night Stalker, ONS. The method of the EAR was to enter homes late at night or during the early morning hours, threaten the lone female victim with a knife or gun and subdue, bind, blindfold, and gag her. He would then proceed to spend a significant amount of time in the residence, before and after raping the victim. Although this method was similar to the Mr. Cruel suspect, the EAR never entered a family home and would most often target lone females. Both offenders did use bondage as a means of controlling their victims. In the Wills and Linus cases, detectives found that specific knots had been used to bind the victim's parents, that they described as uniquely employed by sailors. It was a good circumstantial case, but not goof enough to charge him. We have certainly kept tabs on him since, and if we had another abduction, he'd be the first person dragged in. Operation Spectrum had identified several suspects, one of which was considered the prime suspect by investigators. However, the identities of these men were never publicly released. It would another 13 years before information about these potential suspects was made available. The identity and fate of the suspect, known as Mr. Cruel, had been left unanswered. It was possible he had either been incarcerated for similar but unconnected crimes, moved on to other hunting grounds, become too unwell or infirm to continue his crimes, or had died after the murder of Carmine Chon. It is also entirely possible the memories and keepsakes he had collected from the crimes were enough to satiate his desires. In 2006, some 15 years after the abduction of Carmine Chon, Victoria Police released to the public a significant piece of evidence which they did not disclose during Operation Spectrum. It was reported that one of the victims remembered seeing a tripod present in the bedroom where she was held captive. It was the firm belief of detectives working the case that Mr. Cruel had filmed or photographed his victims in order to keep as souvenirs of his crimes. This information was long kept secret because it was the belief of investigators that if it became public knowledge, the offender might dispose of what would become vital evidence. Australian media outlets began reporting in December 2010 that Victoria Police had reopened their investigation into the Mr. Cruel case. During a review of the original inquiry, known as Operation Spectrum, detectives launched a covert operation in April 2010 called Task Force Apollo, which was a dedicated investigation tasked with capturing the suspect, known as Mr. Cruel. Leading this new investigation was Superintendent Doug Fryer, who said that substantial new intelligence had warranted the establishment of a new task force to explore what he described as every avenue of inquiry. Sifting through a huge stockpile of evidence, Apollo investigators would spend 6 months reviewing hundreds of thousands of pages gathered by Spectrum, which amounted to more than 12,000 pieces of information that needed to be reviewed and cross-referenced with new details as part of the investigation. Much to the shock of task force personnel, it soon became apparent that the stored Spectrum case files were a complete mess. They had been kept mostly unorganized, and many relevant pieces of information had been misfiled. They began the laborious task of transferring them into electronic format. But worse was to come. Superintendent Fryer admitted that some evidence retrieved from the crime scenes at the time has gone missing. One missing item is the tape used to bind one of the victims, which could have provided DNA samples of Mr. Cruel using new forensic technologies. Task Force Apollo investigators had hoped this key piece of evidence could possibly lead to DNA evidence, but it was now missing from police custody. The fact that important evidence had vanished presented the new inquiry with the very real possibility that Mr. Cruel had been an active member of law enforcement, and many within the investigation had to contend with the knowledge that the rapist and suspected murderer might have been under their noses the entire time. Colin McLaren, a retired detective who had been a senior investigator in the original Operation Spectrum Task Force investigation into Mr. Cruel, said that the case was the one that still lingered some 2 decades later. "I probably don't know of any other more important case that I've worked on that still is unsolved," he said. "This strikes at the heart of most parents, if not everybody in the community." Despite the shortcomings of Operation Spectrum, the newly formed task force had learned many important details from the first investigation. At the time the original operation was disbanded, there were 32 suspects who could not be eliminated from inquiries. It was also revealed that Mr. Cruel had a much more complicated pattern of offending that was previously known. He also worked at Camberwell Grammar School, where he taught first aid courses. Knight was initially suspected of abducting and murdering missing schoolgirl Siriacorn Bung Sirabun. The 13-year-old went missing on June 2, 2011. However, police have ruled out any involvement. Detson SGT Chris O'Connor, who had previously worked on the Spectrum Task Force, said Knight had been a person of interest in the Mr. Cruel investigation, one of many the task force hadn't been able to eliminate. Task Force Puma is still actively investigating her abduction. On June 23, 2013, 62-year-old Knight fell to his death in an apparent suicide whilst inside the Melbourne Remand Centre, just hours before he was due in court to face charges of possessing almost 10,000 child porn images. Sines G.T. O'Connor told the Herald Sun, "Given what we know about the man, it is probable that future crimes have been prevented by his death." In a small wooden saloon along the Rio Grande on a desolate stretch of the Chihuahuan Desert in southwest Texas, Judge Roy Bean held court over the local population of Langtree in Val Verde County. Having previously been an adventurer, murderer, and escaped convict, the roguish Bean soon settled into a legitimate life as a saloon keeper and judge. After picking up a smattering of law while running a construction camp saloon, he became known as the only law west of the Pecos, and was fond of handing out his own particular brand of justice. He would regularly stop trial to serve liquor to counsel, jury, and defendants, and play a couple of hands of poker before resuming. Using an outdated law book, the many court cases that came before him would involve the most unorthodox of verdicts, and many ended in fines which were pocketed by Bean. His notable career as Justice of the Peace came to an end with his death in 1903, but his legend has persisted, and there are many humorous anecdotes about his time as the lawman of Langtree. In 1882, the community of Langtree was established by the Southern Pacific Railroad as a grading camp called Eagle Nest. It was later be renamed after the engineer and foreman, George Langtree, who supervised the immigrant Chinese work crews who built the railroad in the area. Soon after completion, a man arrived by the name of Roy Bean, who proceeded to set up a tent saloon on company land. He was then authorized as a justice of peace by a passing Texas Ranger, and began calling himself the only law west of the Pecos. One day, the corpse of a Southern Pacific Railroad workman was found. The man had been died after falling from a high bridge over the Pecos River. Judge Roy Bean sometimes acted as coroner, for which usually collected a $10 burial fee, as well as $10 in court costs. Bean did not think the coroner's $5 fee was enough, and so upon searching the body, he found a revolver and $40 on his person. He declared, "I find this corpse guilty of carrying a concealed weapon, and I fine it $40. Such were the unique and often questionable rulings of Judge Bean, that he would mete out whatever verdicts he saw fit. After all, he was the law in Langtree. But the man who would become the undisputed judge and jury in Val Verde County started his career on the wrong side of the law. Fantley Roy Bean Jr. was born in circa 1825 as the youngest of 5 children to Fantley Roy Bean Sr. and the former Anna Henderson Gore, an extremely poor family in Mason County, Kentucky. At the age of 16, Bean left home to ride a flatboat to New Orleans, where he hoped to find work, but soon got into trouble. He then fled to San Antonio, Texas, to join his elder brother Sam, who had earlier migrated to Independence, Missouri, and worked as a teamster and bull hacker. Sam Bean hauled freight to Santa Fe and then on to Chihuahua, Mexico, after which he fought in the Mexican-American War, before moving to San Antonio, where he was joined by his younger brother. Together they opened a trading post in 1848 in the Mexican state of Chihuahua, but soon Roy Bean was charged with murder by the Mexican authorities. He had shot and killed a Mexican desperado who had threatened to kill a gringo, and to escape, they both fled west to Sonora, Mexico. The younger Bean then moved to San Diego, California in the spring of 1849, where he lived with his other brother Joshua, who would be elected the first mayor of San Diego in 1850. Considered a handsome ladies' man, Bean would compete for the affections of many local women, and was challenged by a rival named John Collins, who suggested they contest their feud with a pistol-shooting match on horseback. Bean was given the task of choosing the targets, and decided that the two men would shoot at each other. The subsequent duel was fought on February 25, 1852, and ended with Collins taking a shot to his right arm. Both men were then arrested and charged with assault with intent to murder. Judge Roy Bean would spend the next 2 months in jail, where he received many gifts from the local women of San Diego, including flowers, cigars, food, and wine. Hidden in some of these gifts were knives, which Bean used to dig through his cell wall and escape on April 17, 1852. He then fled to San Gabriel, California, where he worked as a bartender in his brother Joshua's headquarters saloon, which he inherited in November 1852 upon his brother's murder. Bean continued with his womanizing ways, and in 1854, he courted a young woman who was then kidnapped and forced to marry a Mexican army officer. Bean challenged the man to a duel and killed him. The dead man's friends then took their revenge, and Bean was put on a horse with a rope tied around his neck, leaving him to hang when the horse moved. He managed to stay alive when the rope stretched, and the bride soon emerged from her hiding place and cut him down. He was left with a permanent rope burn on his neck that remained for the rest of his life. Soon after this traumatic experience, Bean decided to move away from California and migrated to New Mexico to live with his brother Sam, who had in the meantime been elected as the first sheriff of Dona Ana County. By 1861, the brothers operated a general store and saloon on Main Street in Pinos Altos, just north of Silver City, New Mexico. There they advertised liquor and a fine billiard table. Bean placed a cannon that belonged to him in front of the store, and which had been used to repel an Apache assault against the town. New Mexico was invaded by the Confederate Army during the Civil War, and during the Battle of Glorieta Pass in March 1852, the Confederates lost their supply wagons, which forced them to retreat to San Antonio. Bean joined the retreating army after taking money from his brother's safe, and for the remainder of the conflict, he served as a guerrilla running naval blockades by hauling cotton from San Antonio to British ships off the coast of Matamoros, then returning with supplies. Over the course of the next 20 years, Bean lived in San Antonio, where he worked as a teamster and engaged in various business opportunities, including attempting to run a firewood company by cutting down a neighbor's timber, and a dairy business, which ended when he was caught watering down the milk. He even worked as a butcher, rustling unbranded cattle from other ranchers in the region for his own business. On October 28, 1866, Bean married 18-year-old Virginia Chavez. Despite them couple having 4 children together, Roy Jr., Laura, Zulema, and Sam, it was a tumultuous union, and within a year of marriage, he was arrested for aggravated assault and threatening the life of his wife. The family lived in what was described as a poverty-stricken Mexican slum area called Beanville. By the late 1870s, Bean was operating his own saloon in Beanville, and was known about town for his roguish behavior. He soon got wind that many construction camps were being set up when several railroad companies began working to extend the railroads westwards. A local store owner was so anxious to have this unscrupulous character out of the neighborhood that she decided to buy up all of Bean's possessions for $900 so that he could promptly leave San Antonio. By this time, he had separated from his wife and left his children to the care of friends as he prepared to move west. With the money he received, he purchased a large tent, various supplies to sell, and 10 55-gallon barrels of whiskey. In the spring of 1882, he had established a small saloon near the Pecos River, in a tent city he named Vinegaroon. He had chosen this site because within 32 kilometers of the settlement, there were some 8,000 railroad workers, all of whom would buy his wares and whiskey. The nearest court was located some 320 kilometers away at Fort Stockton, and there was little anyone could do to stop lawbreakers. By August 2nd, 1882, Bean was appointed Justice of the Peace for the new Precinct 6 in Pecos County, after a request by a Texas Ranger for the setting up of a local law jurisdiction in Venegaroon. Before his appointment, Bean had his first case on July 25, 1882, when Joe Bell was brought in by Texas Rangers to be tried. One of Bean's first acts as the newly installed Justice of the Peace was to shoot up the saloon shack of a Jewish competitor. He then turned his tent saloon in a part-time courtroom, and thereafter became known as the only law west of the Pecos. When acting as judge, Bean relied on a single law book, the 1879 edition of the Revised Statutes of Texas, a mostly out-of-date copy, and when newer law books appeared, he would use them as kindling. He meted out his own particular brand of justice, and disallowed hung juries or even appeals. Jurors were selected from among his favorite bar customers, who were expected to buy a drink during every court recess. He was well known for his unusual court rulings. In one such case, an Irishman named Paddy O'Rourke was arrested after he shot a Chinese laborer. During the trial at Bean's saloon courtroom, a mob of some 200 angry Irishmen surrounded the court, threatening to lynch Bean if O'Rourke was not freed. After leafing through his law book, Bean declared that homicide was the killing of a human being. However, he could find no law against killing a Chinaman, and immediately dismissed the charges. In another, when a young ranchman was fined $5 for fighting, he produced witnesses that he had not been fighting, but had in fact held the other person off. Bean remitted the fine, and instead fined the other man $10, who had in the meantime skipped town. The ranchman was committed until the fine was paid. In the end, the ranchman paid the fine. By December 1882, construction of the railroad had moved farther westwards, and Bean decided to move his courtroom and saloon some 110 kilometers to Strawbridge. He sent for his children to join him, where they would live with him in the saloon, with his youngest son Sam often sleeping on a pool table. When a competitor laced Bean's whiskey with kerosene, he was unable to attract customers, and so left the area and moved to Eagle's Nest, 32 kilometers west of the Pecos River, which was soon renamed Langtree. The original owner of the land, who also ran a saloon, had sold around 640 acres to the railroad company, on the condition that no part of the land could be sold or leased to Roy Bean. In order to counter this clause, Bean was given advice by O'Rourke, the Irishman whose case he had previously dismissed, that he should use to railroad right-of-way, which was not covered by the contract. Bean was then able to squat on land he had no legal right to use. Bean eventually erected a wooden structure for his saloon, which he renamed the Jersey Lily Langtree, in honor of Lily Langtree, the actress, who would recount in her autobiography that she didn't visit the area until after Bean's death. She did, however, send him a pair of Colt .45 pistols as a gift. The saloon courtroom did not have a jail, and instead it is reported that a large oak tree with a heavy log chain served as the jail for those who were unable to pay their fines. As per the law, fines were to be handed over to the state, but instead Judge Roy Bean kept all of the money. In most cases, fines handed out by Bean were for the exact amount the accused person was carrying. In one incident, when a train passenger tossed a $20 gold piece for a beer, Bean refused to give any change. When the stranger protested, Bean fined him $19.95 for contempt of court and threatened to double the fine if the stranger said another word. The stranger left on a train. Despite the mandate that only district courts were legally allowed to grant divorces, Bean did so anyway and pocketed $10 for each divorce. He would charge $5 for weddings and ended all wedding ceremonies with the phrase, "And may God have mercy on your souls," which was traditionally said when a death sentence is carried out. When a Mexican received permission for one day off from work by his boss to marry his future wife, there was not enough time to secure a license. Judge Roy Bean married them anyway, and proclaimed that the marriage license would arrive by the next day's mail after charging them his usual $5 marriage fee. After he performed the marriage of two Mexican couples, they later came before Bean and asked to be divorced and remarried to the other person's spouses. Bean agreed to the demand, charging each $10 for marriages and $40 for divorces. He continued to conduct his own brand of law within his courtroom, and when a railroad contractor named Howard, who had some law training, was brought into court and read from the latest revised law statutes, Bean remitted the fine but rendered a verdict that no law books were to be brought into his court. A rival saloon owner named Torano was brought before Bean charged with assault. A jury of 6 of Bean's regulars found the accused guilty and fined him 24 bottles of beer. Bean forbid his rival from buying beer at his own saloon and instead had him pay retail fine at the Jersey Lily. Bean won re-election to his post in 1884, but was defeated in 1886. By the following year, the Commissioner's Court created a new precinct in the county, and Bean was appointed to be the new Justice of the Peace. He would continue to be re-elected until 1896, and after his defeat, it was reported he refused to surrender his seal and law book and continued to try all cases north of the tracks. In 1890, Bean received word that railroad developer, speculator, and robber Baron J. Gould, who had once attempted to take control of the Erie Railroad from Cornelius Vanderbilt, was passing through Langtree on a special train. Bean flagged down the train using the danger signal, and believing the bridge was out, the engineer stopped the train. To his surprise, Gould and his daughter were then invited by Bean to visit the saloon as his guests. The Gould's 2-hour visit reportedly caused a brief panic on the New York Stock Exchange, when it was erroneously reported that Gould had been killed in a train crash. On April 16, 1897, there was an accidental collision between 2 trains during which one man, Robert Beckman, was killed and 4 others scalded. The inquest was presided over by Judge Bean, who brought the body of Beckman to Langtree for burial in the Langtree graveyard. Judge Roy Bean organized an 1896 World Championship boxing title bout between Bob Fitzsimmons and Peter Marr on an island in the Rio Grande. The fight was hosted there because boxing matches were illegal in both Texas and Mexico. As a result of the fight, which lasted only 1 minute and 35 seconds, and was won by Fitzsimmons, Bean's fame throughout the United States. During his term as a judge, and despite his becoming known as a hanging judge, Bean was known to have sentenced only 2 men to hang, one of whom escaped. In most other jurisdictions, horse thieves were often sentenced to death, but Bean always allowed them to go if the horses were returned to their owners. As was reported in March 1897's edition of Leslie's Weekly Read, the picture in your publication of March 11th of Judge Roy Bean is all right, except the collar and cravat. He was once trying a Mexican on a charge of horse stealing, and his charge was the shortest on record. Gentlemen of the jury, there's a greaser in the box and a hoss missing. You know your duty, and they did. In the later years, Bean spent much of his profits helping the poor of the area and always made sure that the local schoolhouse had free firewood in the winter. In January 1901, it was reported that Bean stated that a claim for damages of $13,000 from Apache depredations of his mules would certainly be allowed. On March 16, 1903, after a bout of heavy drinking in San Antonio, Roy Bean died peacefully in his bed. He was interred, along with his son, Sam Bean, 1874 to 1907, at the Whitehead Memorial Museum in Del Rio. In 1965, as part of the Civil War Centennial Commemoration in Texas, an official Texas historical marker honoring Roy Bean was erected on the museum grounds in Del Rio, Texas. Bean has been portrayed on both the small and big screen by a variety of actors. In the 1940 film The Westerner, he was played by Walter Brennan, for which he won a Best Supporting Actor Academy Award. The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean, a 1972 heavily fictionalized theatrical biopic, starred Paul Newman as Bean, while Ned Beatty portrayed the Langtree judge in the 1995 TV miniseries Streets of Laredo, starring alongside James Garner, and based on the Larry McMurtry novel of the same name. In the 1969 film A Time for Dying, which portrayed the Vinegaroon period, starred Audie Murphy starred as Jesse James, and Victor Jory played a half-crazed Judge Roy Bean. Brad Sullivan played Judge Roy Bean in the television movie The Gambler, The Luck of the Draw, alongside Kenny Rogers and Reba McEntire. Bean is best remembered as a scallywag of the lawless Wild West, the gambler, saloon keeper, and one-time smuggler, who found himself as the ultimate law west of the Pecos.